What if I told you that one of the most infamous murders in American history still has no answer after 75 years? Elizabeth Short, a young woman whose tragic end became the stuff of nightmares, was found mutilated and abandoned in a Los Angeles park. But the real mystery, her killer has never been caught. This is the story of the Black Dahlia murder, a crime so shocking, it still haunts the City of Angels. Stick with me because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about the case and the dark secrets of Hollywood itself. Welcome to Crime Headquarters. I know many of you use these stories to unwind and drift off to sleep, and tonight you're in for a very scary, very tragic one. So, get cozy, whether you're in bed or somewhere comfortable, and let go of the day. Before you let your mind drift off, take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and get ready. You're about to hear one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries in history, the Black Dahlia murder. Ready? Let's begin. It was January 15th, 1947, when the body of a young woman was discovered in a vacant lot in Los Angeles. The scene was nothing short of chilling. Her body had been gruesomely severed in half, her limbs arranged with eerie precision. Her face was frozen in a haunting expression, and there was no sign of blood at the scene, which led investigators to believe that the killer had drained her body before leaving it for the world to see. The body would become one of the most infamous in history, Elizabeth Short, later known as the Black Dahlia. Before that day, Elizabeth Short was just another hopeful young woman trying to make her way in Hollywood. Born on July 29, 1924, in Boston, Massachusetts, Elizabeth's life had been far from easy. Her father, Cleo Short, had disappeared when she was just a child, leaving her mother, Phoebe, to raise Elizabeth and her three sisters on her own. The family struggled financially, but Elizabeth had big dreams. She moved to California in 1943, hoping to find fame and fortune in Hollywood, like many young women before her. But Elizabeth's path to stardom was not as glamorous as she had hoped. While she was undeniably beautiful, with striking dark hair and piercing blue eyes, her dream of becoming an actress never quite materialized. She had a few minor roles in films and appeared in small theater productions, but she wasn't able to break through in the way she had imagined. Despite her lack of success, Elizabeth kept her hopes alive. She was known to frequent the Hollywood scene, living from place to place, and often staying with friends or acquaintances. As she chased her dream, she also found herself in a string of brief, sometimes troubled relationships with men, including a few well-known figures in Hollywood. But even with these connections, her dreams never fully came true. The most troubling part of Elizabeth's life was her constant struggle with homelessness and poverty. She was often in and out of motels and hospitals, sometimes living off the charity of others. It was said that she had a somewhat wild side and was involved with some dangerous individuals, though her exact relationships were never fully documented. Her life in Hollywood wasn't just filled with ambition and fleeting fame. It was also marked by moments of deep loneliness. It's no surprise that, despite the dazzling lights of Tinseltown, Elizabeth never found what she was truly seeking. Instead, she wandered the streets, a figure caught between dreams of stardom and the harsh realities of a city that could chew up and spit out the vulnerable. Elizabeth Short's story, tragic as it was, would take a dark and twisted turn. Her dreams of being a movie star would ultimately end in the most horrifying of ways. But how did a young woman, full of potential and hopes, end up brutally murdered, her body severed and abandoned in a vacant lot? To understand that, we need to look at the fateful day when her body was discovered, the day that would change everything. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, Betty Berzinger, a housewife taking a stroll with her young daughter, was the first to find the body. As they walked through the Leimert Park area of Los Angeles, Betty noticed something unusual in the distance. At first, she thought it was a mannequin lying in the grass. But as she got closer, her heart sank. What she had thought was a mannequin was, in fact, a woman's lifeless body, cut in half at the waist and carefully arranged. Betty screamed, clutching her daughter, and immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they were confronted with a scene so horrific it almost defied belief. The body was that of a young woman, later identified as Elizabeth Short, but there was no sign of blood at the scene. Her body had been meticulously cleaned and drained of all fluids, leading investigators to believe that her killer had done so before abandoning her. The details of the crime were disturbing. Elizabeth's body had been severed neatly at the waist, with the two parts of her body positioned several feet apart. Her legs were outstretched, while her torso was positioned in a way that suggested the killer had carefully placed her there. Her arms were positioned at her sides, and her hands were turned palms up. Her lips had been cut in a grotesque smile, and a piece of cloth had been shoved into her mouth. The body was naked, but there were no signs of sexual assault, which only deepened the mystery of the crime. What was the killer's motive? Why would someone go to such lengths to mutilate and display the body in such a gruesome way? As news of the discovery spread, the press immediately descended on the scene. The body was identified as Elizabeth Short, and the investigation into her death began. The public was horrified, and the crime captured the attention of the nation. But there was one problem. There was no clear lead, no clear suspect. The investigation quickly turned into a spectacle, with the media focusing on every detail of Elizabeth's life and trying to make sense of her death. As detectives scrambled to find answers, they uncovered a troubling lack of clues. Elizabeth had no wallet, no identification, no personal belongings on her body. It was as if she had been erased, her identity wiped away. The investigation was stalled from the start, and the public's fascination with the case only grew. How could something so brutal and senseless happen? Who would commit such a horrific act? And why? The police launched a full-scale investigation into Elizabeth's death, questioning everyone who might have known her, but they found little to go on. Her family back in Massachusetts hadn't heard from her in weeks, and those who had seen her in the days leading up to her death didn't know much about her personal life. Elizabeth had kept her relationships and movements a secret, which only made it harder for the authorities to piece together the events leading up to her murder. One of the most perplexing aspects of the investigation was the discovery of an anonymous letter sent to the Los Angeles Examiner newspaper. Shortly after Elizabeth's body was found, a letter arrived at the paper, postmarked from Los Angeles. It was typed with no return address, and it was filled with disturbing details about the crime. The letter claimed to be from the killer, and it included a piece of Elizabeth Short's personal property, a name card with her address and phone number. The letter read, "I will go to the police and tell them that I have committed the crime. They will find out who I am." The police were both intrigued and disturbed by the letter, but it didn't provide any concrete evidence that could lead them to a suspect. The handwriting didn't match any of the suspects they had already interviewed, and the letter was, as most of the evidence in the case, cryptic and elusive. As the investigation continued, more and more theories emerged. Some people speculated that the murder was the work of a serial killer. Others believed that Elizabeth had been targeted by someone she had known, perhaps a lover or a jilted ex. But with no physical evidence and no clear leads, the case quickly went cold. In the meantime, the media continued to bombard the public with sensational stories about Elizabeth's life. They painted her as a mysterious woman, caught between the allure of Hollywood fame and the dark realities of her circumstances. The press gave her the moniker the Black Dahlia, a reference to a popular film at the time called The Blue Dahlia. The nickname would come to define her tragic story, but it also turned her into a symbol of the darkness lurking beneath the shiny surface of Hollywood. As the investigation stalled, the press turned up the heat, publishing sensational stories about Elizabeth's life and speculating wildly about her murder. They interviewed everyone who had known her, from fellow actresses to acquaintances, trying to piece together her last days. Some stories painted her as a tragic figure, others as a woman with a secret life, a woman involved with dangerous men. As the theories swirled, the public became obsessed. Was Elizabeth's death the result of a jealous lover, a disgruntled acquaintance, or something more sinister? Theories about her life and death ranged from plausible to downright bizarre. Some people even speculated that her killer was a member of the Hollywood elite, someone with enough power and influence to keep their identity hidden. One theory that gained traction was that Elizabeth had been murdered by someone she had known personally. There were several reports of her spending time with men in Hollywood who had mysterious connections to the crime. But no one could provide concrete evidence that any of them had a motive, and the lack of physical evidence left the investigation in limbo. Then, another letter arrived. This time, it was sent directly to the police, and it was even more cryptic than the first. The writer claimed to be the killer again, but this time, the letter was filled with more disturbing details, none of which led to any solid evidence. As the months went by, the case seemed to lose steam, and the once high-profile investigation began to fade from the public's attention. But Elizabeth Short's name would not be forgotten. Her story, the story of a beautiful young woman with dreams of Hollywood stardom, would live on in the shadows of Los Angeles' darkest corners. The Black Dahlia murder remains unsolved to this day. Despite numerous investigations, theories, and suspects over the years, Elizabeth Short's killer has never been identified. Over 75 years have passed since that fateful January morning, yet the mystery continues to captivate and haunt the imaginations of people around the world. Many have tried to solve the case, some with legitimate theories, others with more far-fetched ideas. But no one has been able to uncover the truth behind Elizabeth's death. The case remains one of the most haunting and baffling in criminal history. Her name lives on in books, movies, and documentaries, but the questions still linger. Who killed Elizabeth Short? Why was she murdered? And what dark secrets was she carrying with her? The Black Dahlia murder is not just a tragic crime. It is a symbol of the darkness that exists beneath the surface of fame and fortune, a reminder of the price some are forced to pay for their dreams. As the decades go by, the case still haunts Los Angeles, and the mystery of the Black Dahlia lingers in the air, as chilling and unresolved as ever. Story 2. The Lindbergh Kidnapping. On the night of March 1st, 1932, the unthinkable happened. The 20-month-old son of one of the world's most famous men, Charles Lindbergh, was kidnapped from his crib. The nation was gripped with horror. A ransom was paid, but the child was never returned. Weeks later, a discovery was made that would forever haunt America. The lifeless body of Charles Lindbergh Jr. What followed was a media frenzy, an investigation that captivated the world, and a trial that would forever be known as the crime of the century. Who could commit such a chilling act? And would justice ever be served? March 1st, 1932, began like any other night for the Lindbergh family. They lived in a beautiful, secluded home in Hopewell, New Jersey, a place far removed from the chaos of the city, the perfect sanctuary for a family in the public eye. Charles Lindbergh, the famed aviator who had made history in 1927 by completing the first solo nonstop transatlantic flight, and his wife, Anne, a respected author and public figure in her own right, were a power couple in America. Their only child, 20-month-old Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., was a beloved symbol of their family's future. But on that fateful night, everything changed. Charles Lindbergh Jr. was taken from his crib. In the hours before dawn, the Lindberghs' peaceful world was shattered. Charles and Anne Lindbergh were sleeping soundly when, in the dead of night, an intruder broke into their home, climbed the side of the house using a ladder, and snatched their young son from his bed. The kidnapper was meticulous in his planning. A ransom note was left on the windowsill where Charles Jr. had been sleeping. It was handwritten, a mix of upper and lowercase letters, carefully constructed and precise in its demands. "We have your baby. We will demand $50,000 for his safe return." The Lindberghs' immediate reaction was to alert the authorities, and soon, the police were on the scene. The local police, along with the state police, began investigating right away. A search of the surrounding area was organized, but the kidnapper had vanished without a trace. The media descended on the scene, as news of the kidnapping spread like wildfire. The Lindberghs were not just the parents of an innocent child, they were international celebrities. Their grief was shared by millions, and their story became the lead story in every newspaper. As the hours turned into days, Charles Lindbergh did what any desperate parent would do. He offered the ransom. The police, along with the Lindberghs, worked under the assumption that paying the ransom would bring their son home safely. After all, this was the common practice in such cases at the time. The ransom money, totaling $50,000, was carefully prepared and left in the agreed-upon location. The Lindberghs, now hopeful that their son would return, waited. But the story was far from over. Days passed, and the Lindberghs held on to the slim hope that the ransom would bring their child back. But the first break in the case didn't come in the way they had anticipated. Instead of the kidnappers' communication leading to Charles Jr.'s return, it brought confusion and further torment. The kidnapper, in his cryptic messages, continued to demand the ransom, but the trail began to grow cold. The Lindberghs, under immense pressure, had given the money as instructed, but they received no further word. The police had no clear leads, and they were growing desperate. At the same time, the media attention surrounding the case intensified, and every new detail of the investigation was scrutinized by the public. After the ransom was paid, there was still no sign of Charles Jr. Days turned into weeks, and the Lindberghs' hope began to fade. Yet, the story of the kidnapping wasn't done gripping the nation. The whole country watched in horror as the Lindbergh family, at their wits' end, still had no idea where their son was or whether he was alive. As law enforcement officials continued to dig into the details of the ransom and the crime, something troubling came to light. The kidnapper had been thorough in covering his tracks, but he had left a trace of evidence behind that would prove to be a key turning point in the investigation. A witness came forward, reporting that they had seen a man leaving a gas station with a large sum of cash that matched the serial numbers of the ransom money. This was the first breakthrough in a case that had been shrouded in mystery. It was a lead the police had to follow, but the suspect was still unknown. The frustration of not knowing where Charles Jr. was, and whether he was still alive, was beginning to take its toll on the Lindberghs. But they continued to cooperate with the police, determined to do whatever it took to bring their son home. The days seemed endless as the investigation stretched on. But even in the midst of their grief, the Lindberghs refused to give up. They knew that if they didn't act quickly, their son might be lost forever. In the early hours of May 12, 1932, the Lindbergh family's worst nightmare was realized. The body of 20-month-old Charles Lindbergh Jr. was discovered in a wooded area less than 5 miles from the family's home. The child's body was found by a truck driver who had been passing through the area. He saw the small, lifeless form lying in the grass, abandoned and discarded. The body was badly decomposed, a tragic sight that left no question about the fate of the Lindbergh child. A detailed examination of the remains revealed that Charles Jr. had suffered a fractured skull, and it was determined that he had been killed shortly after his abduction. There were no signs of sexual assault, which led investigators to theorize that the motive was not sexual in nature, but something else entirely. Was this the result of a botched kidnapping, or had the kidnappers' motives been more sinister from the beginning? For the Lindberghs, the news of their child's death was crushing. After months of waiting, of holding on to the hope that their son might be brought back to them, they were now forced to confront the brutal reality that Charles Jr. was gone. Their grief was compounded by the fact that the person responsible for this unspeakable crime was still at large. The discovery of Charles Jr.'s body was not just a personal tragedy for the Lindberghs, it was a national tragedy. The entire country mourned with them, and the public demanded justice. The investigation, now in full swing, would soon uncover a lead that would lead to an arrest, and the case would take another shocking turn. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators traced the serial numbers of the ransom money to a man named Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant who had been living in the United States for several years. Hauptmann had used some of the ransom money to purchase goods in local stores, and this small trace of evidence would soon unravel the mystery. Hauptmann was arrested on September 19, 1934, and charged with the kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr. The arrest was based on circumstantial evidence, including Hauptmann's possession of marked ransom bills and a ladder that matched the one used in the kidnapping. Despite Hauptmann's insistence that he was innocent, the case against him seemed to be growing stronger. The arrest sent shockwaves through the public, who had been following the case for months. Hauptmann was known to be a carpenter who had lived in the Bronx. He was an immigrant who had arrived in the United States in the 1920s and had struggled financially ever since. His arrest led many to believe that Hauptmann was the culprit, but there were others who raised questions. Could Hauptmann, a seemingly ordinary man, have been the mastermind behind such a horrific crime? Hauptmann's trial was a media sensation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, and every detail of the trial was broadcast to the public. The prosecution presented their case, which included testimony from witnesses who placed Hauptmann near the Lindbergh estate and evidence that tied him to the ransom money. But Hauptmann maintained his innocence, claiming that he had been framed. In the end, the evidence seemed too overwhelming to ignore. On February 13, 1935, after weeks of deliberation, the jury convicted Hauptmann of kidnapping and murder. He was sentenced to death by electrocution. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, some people still believed that Bruno Hauptmann was innocent. His defense team mounted an appeal, claiming that the evidence had been mishandled and that Hauptmann had been wrongfully convicted. But the appeals were denied, and on April 3, 1936, Hauptmann was executed in the electric chair at the New Jersey State Prison. The execution did not bring closure for everyone. Some people believed that Hauptmann had been framed, while others thought he was guilty but didn't act alone. The case remained shrouded in mystery and debate, and the question of whether justice had truly been served remained unanswered. For the Lindberghs, the execution of Bruno Hauptmann did not erase the pain of losing their son. The kidnapping had forever changed their lives, and the shadow of that tragedy would haunt them for years to come. Charles Lindbergh, once a hero to the American public, would never be the same. His public image, once synonymous with courage and adventure, was now forever intertwined with the heartbreak of his son's death. The Lindbergh kidnapping remains one of the most widely discussed and debated criminal cases in American history. The case led to the passage of the Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping a federal offense. It also became a symbol of the dangers of celebrity and the vulnerability that comes with fame. As the years passed, the case continued to fascinate and horrify people. It remains the crime of the century, a dark chapter in American history, and a reminder of the devastation a single act of violence can cause. Story 3. The Murder of JonBenet Ramsey. What if the person responsible for the murder of 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey was someone she trusted? What if the ransom note was just a distraction, leading investigators down a trail of dead ends? More than 25 years later, the truth remains hidden, and the chilling mystery of who killed JonBenet still haunts us. It was Christmas night, 1996, in Boulder, Colorado, a time of joy and celebration. For the Ramsey family, it should have been the perfect holiday. The Ramsey home was filled with lights, laughter, and the warmth of a family gathered together. But this night would be different. This Christmas would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would never end. JonBenet Patricia Ramsey, just 6 years old, had been the star of her family, the apple of her father John's eye. She had a radiant smile, the kind that could light up a room. A petite blonde beauty with big blue eyes, JonBenet had been the perfect little pageant princess, winning titles and adoration in beauty competitions. But despite her public persona, JonBenet was just a little girl, curious, playful, and full of life. That night, after a long day of celebrations, JonBenet was tucked into her bed in the basement of the family's large, upscale home. She had been doted on all day by her mother, Patsy Ramsey, a former beauty queen herself, who had big dreams for her daughter. The house was decorated for Christmas, and the Ramsey family had spent the day together, just like any other holiday. It was supposed to be a time of happiness, but by morning, everything would be forever changed. Around 5:30 a.m. on December 26th, Patsy Ramsey woke up to a terrifying discovery. JonBenet was missing. At first, Patsy thought she had just wandered off or gone to the bathroom. But as the minutes passed and the realization set in that she wasn't in the house, panic quickly took hold. Patsy ran to JonBenet's room, but it was empty. She began frantically searching the house, calling for her daughter, but there was no sign of JonBenet. Then, In the midst of her frantic search, Patsy noticed something that made her heart drop: the ransom note. The note was long, written on a piece of paper found on the stairs of the home. It read, "We have your daughter. She is safe and unharmed. If you want to see her again, you will follow our instructions carefully. We demand $118,000 for her safe return." The note went on, giving specific instructions on how to deliver the money, with the chilling promise that JonBenet would be returned safely if the terms were met. At first, the ransom demand seemed absurdly specific, and the amount of $118,000, oddly close to a bonus that JonBenet's father, John Ramsey, had received earlier that year, struck many as strange. The note was signed with a cryptic "victory," a word that would only add to the mystery. In the immediate aftermath, Patsy called 911, and within minutes, the police arrived. The situation quickly escalated, and detectives began to pour over the Ramsey home. As the minutes turned into hours, the Ramsey's home became a crime scene, but there were no signs of forced entry, no clear evidence that an intruder had broken in. Instead, the house appeared undisturbed, almost too pristine. Nothing was out of place. If someone had entered, why had they left the house in such a meticulous state? John and Patsy were in a state of shock, their emotions a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and panic. They had just learned that their daughter was gone, and the only thing left was this bizarre ransom note. For John, it felt as if his world had been torn apart. The family's life, built around their bright, beautiful daughter, seemed to be unraveling before his eyes. As police scoured the house and began to investigate the possibility of a kidnapping, the Ramsey family's worst nightmare began to take shape. Had JonBenet been taken by a stranger, or had someone known to the family been involved? There were no clear answers, only the gnawing fear that time was running out. The first hours of the investigation were a blur. Law enforcement began questioning the family and friends, and the house was locked down as police began their search for any clues. But as the hours turned into a long, agonizing day, the Ramseys were left in limbo. The uncertainty of their daughter's fate was unbearable. They were told that the ransom note and the circumstances didn't suggest a simple kidnapping, and there were suspicions that the crime was more complex than it appeared. Despite the growing anxiety, the authorities continued to follow the instructions in the ransom note. The police tried to trace the money, hoping that a trail of currency would lead them to JonBenet's location. But the more they investigated, the more questions arose. Why had the ransom note been left in such a conspicuous place? Why hadn't the kidnapper simply taken the money and disappeared? It seemed that the person or persons who had taken JonBenet wasn't interested in just a simple ransom exchange. As nightfall approached, the situation had reached a crisis point. Still no sign of JonBenet, still no leads. But then, just as the world outside seemed to hold its breath, John Ramsey made a discovery in the home that would turn the case upside down. Around 1 p.m. that afternoon, after hours of searching the house, John Ramsey himself found JonBenet's body in the basement, hidden beneath a blanket. Her small frame was lifeless, her body showing signs of blunt force trauma. She had been strangled with a garrote, a method so precise and brutal that it immediately suggested that the person responsible knew what they were doing. JonBenet's body had been discarded, hidden in a dark corner of the basement, not far from where the ransom note had been found earlier. The location of the body raised immediate questions. Why had the kidnapper left the child's body in such a familiar place? Why not take her somewhere else? What had happened to her in those long, agonizing hours? The moment John Ramsey discovered his daughter's lifeless body was the moment the investigation took a darker, more sinister turn. No longer was the family simply dealing with the disappearance of their little girl. They were now facing the harsh reality that their daughter had been murdered. The scene that followed was chaotic. The family was in complete shock. The police were scrambling to process the crime scene, and the media had already begun to swarm, hungry for details. JonBenet's death would soon be one of the most covered and debated cases in modern American history, with theories and suspicions mounting almost immediately. As law enforcement attempted to make sense of the crime, the public had already begun to form their own conclusions. The Ramsey family was quickly thrust into the spotlight, and suspicion began to grow. Many in the media speculated that the family had something to hide. Were they involved in their daughter's death? Or was there a more sinister player lurking outside the Ramsey household? The investigation into JonBenét's death would become a tangled web of missteps, dead ends, and mounting public scrutiny. The family, already reeling from the loss of their daughter, was now facing an equally terrifying enemy: public suspicion. JonBenét's murder had become not just a crime to be solved, but a mystery that would captivate the nation for years to come. As detectives began their pursuit of the truth, the question lingered: who killed JonBené Ramsey? The discovery of JonBené Ramsey's body changed everything. What had initially been a frantic search for a missing child was now a full-blown murder investigation. The scene was chaotic. The house was crawling with police officers, FBI agents, and detectives, all trying to piece together the tragedy that had unfolded. Yet, despite the immediate and overwhelming response, nothing about the case made sense. The basement, where JonBenét's body had been found, had not been disturbed by police during their initial search. In fact, the fact that the body was hidden in plain sight, tucked away in a small, dark room, raised even more questions. Why had the kidnapper, if indeed it was a kidnapping, taken JonBené to such a conspicuous location? Why hadn't they disposed of her body elsewhere, far away from the scene of the crime? The more investigators looked, the less they understood. The first major hurdle was the ransom note. The police, initially convinced that it was a genuine note from the kidnapper, quickly realized something didn't add up. The ransom demand was unusually specific, but the wording was odd, almost theatrical. It read as though it had been written by someone trying to sound menacing, but there was something about it that didn't ring true. The note was a bizarre combination of demands and odd phrasing, making it seem almost like a script for a crime movie. And why had the kidnapper left it inside the house, rather than taking it with him? This only deepened the sense that something wasn't right. The demand for $118,000, almost exactly the amount of John Ramsey's bonus from his business, was another strange detail. Felt too precise, too personal. Was it a coincidence? Or was the kidnapper somehow familiar with the family's financial situation? Another perplexing detail was that, despite the presence of a ransom note, the rest of the house was untouched. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows or doors, no struggle. JonBenét's body was found in a part of the house that was far from the living areas, tucked away in the basement. If an intruder had been involved, why had they not left any trace of a violent break-in? The lack of any physical evidence pointing to a stranger raised suspicion and quickly turned the investigation inward, focusing on the people closest to JonBené, her family. The Ramsey family, already in shock from the loss of their daughter, were now under intense scrutiny. Detectives began to question each of them, trying to find any inconsistencies or strange behaviors. John and Patsy Ramsey were understandably distraught, but the questions kept coming. Why was JonBenét's body found in the basement? And why had it taken so long for it to be discovered? Could they have missed something during the initial search? Or worse, had they known all along? The police zeroed in on the family as possible suspects. After all, who else could have had access to the house? The fact that there had been no signs of forced entry meant the killer was likely someone who had been inside the house already. The media, eager for any shred of information, had already begun to speculate about the family's involvement. The couple's behavior in the aftermath of the tragedy was heavily analyzed. Patsy, in particular, came under intense scrutiny due to her past as a former beauty queen and her obvious involvement in JonBenét's pageant career. Some believed that JonBenét's death had been the result of an accident during one of these pageants, or even that Patsy herself had accidentally caused it in a moment of frustration. Despite the growing suspicion surrounding the family, no definitive evidence was found linking the Ramseys to the crime. In fact, as the investigation continued, evidence began to point in a different direction, toward a possible intruder. The police began to look into the possibility that someone had broken into the house, abducted JonBené, and murdered her before returning her body to the basement. As unlikely as this theory seemed, it was one that still couldn't be dismissed entirely. In the days following the discovery of JonBenét's body, the police began canvassing the neighborhood, looking for anyone who might have seen something out of the ordinary. But the investigation only led to more questions than answers. While the police turned their attention to possible intruders, they also began to dig deeper into the Ramsey family's background. The media was relentless in their pursuit of a story, eager to uncover any hint of scandal or hidden secrets. There were rumors circulating about JonBenét's pageant career, about whether her mother had pushed her too hard, whether there had been a strained relationship between JonBenet and her family. There were even whispers about the involvement of family friends or acquaintances. But with no concrete leads, the investigators had to proceed carefully. By now, the case had taken on a life of its own. The media frenzy surrounding JonBenét's murder only intensified. The nation watched in disbelief as more and more theories about the crime surfaced. Some suggested that JonBenet had been killed by someone close to her, while others leaned toward the possibility of a deranged outsider breaking into the Ramsey home. But no matter how many theories emerged, there were no answers, no leads, no clear suspect. The police had no choice but to continue the investigation, but they were hampered by the lack of physical evidence. The house had been cleaned and tidied before police had arrived, and the crime scene had been contaminated by the rush to search for clues. The family, in their desperation to find JonBenet, had unknowingly made the investigation more difficult by inadvertently disturbing potential evidence. The longer the investigation dragged on, the more complicated it became, and the closer the police got to discovering a chilling truth, one that would forever shape the course of the case. The discovery of JonBenet Ramsey's body in the basement of her own home marked a turning point in the investigation. The tragedy had taken a darker twist, and the case now became a public spectacle. The Ramsey family, already in shock and devastated by the loss of their daughter, now found themselves thrust under the harsh spotlight of the media and public scrutiny. As the investigation progressed, a range of theories began to emerge, each one more chilling than the last. Was JonBenét's death the result of a botched kidnapping, or was it something far more sinister? An inside job carried out by someone close to her? From the moment JonBenét's body was discovered, suspicion fell on the Ramsey family. The fact that the body had been found inside the house with no sign of forced entry led many to believe that the killer must have had access to the house. The initial investigation seemed to focus heavily on the parents, John and Patsy Ramsey. After all, if the crime wasn't the work of an outsider, the most likely suspects were the people closest to JonBenet. The police questioned John and Patsy extensively. Both parents were obviously distraught and cooperative, but their grief was read as suspicious by some. John Ramsey had been the one to find JonBenét's body, and his actions after the discovery, carrying her upstairs and then calling the police, were seen by some as questionable. But John maintained that he had simply been following his instincts to try to revive his daughter when he found her in the basement. Patsy, too, came under heavy scrutiny. She had been deeply involved in JonBenét's pageant career, and some speculated that the intense pressure surrounding the beauty competitions might have played a role in her daughter's tragic death. In the media, rumors swirled about Patsy's potential role in the crime. Some speculated that she may have accidentally killed JonBenet in a fit of rage, or even in a moment of frustration over her daughter's pageant life. Others, however, saw Patsy as a grieving mother, caught in a nightmare she could not have possibly foreseen. As investigators delved deeper into the family's history, they found no prior history of abuse or conflict. Both John and Patsy had clean records, with no known history of violence. But the police were still left with too many unanswered questions. Why had the ransom note been left behind? Was it really a kidnapping gone wrong, or was there something darker at play? The ransom note itself remained one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Its strange wording and unusually high demand for $118,000 seemed too specific to be random. Some investigators even speculated that the amount could have been chosen because it was close to the amount of John Ramsey's bonus from work that year. The note's tone was theatrical, almost like a script, and it seemed to deliberately draw attention to itself. But why would the kidnapper leave a note in the house, especially when they had no intention of taking the ransom money and returning JonBenet. A key point of suspicion was the odd timing of the ransom note's discovery. Patsy Ramsey had reportedly found the note early in the morning, before John had gone to work. But when the police arrived, they couldn't find any signs of forced entry. It seemed odd that someone would have entered the home, left a ransom note, and then taken JonBenet without a struggle. This led investigators to wonder if the crime was staged, if someone had written the note to make it look like an abduction. But in reality, JonBenet had already been murdered before the note was even placed. What made the situation even more suspicious was that the ransom note seemed almost too perfect. The handwriting was neat, and the tone was almost overly dramatic, giving the impression that the kidnapper was trying too hard to create a sense of urgency. It didn't feel like a real ransom note, at least not in the sense that an actual abductor would leave it. Despite this, the investigation was determined to continue with the theory of a kidnapping gone wrong. But with the discovery of JonBenet's body, the question shifted. If this was truly a kidnapping, then why hadn't the kidnapper taken the ransom money? And why had they left the body so close to home? Something about the crime didn't add up. As police began to consider the possibility of an intruder, the focus of the investigation shifted away from the Ramsey family, at least temporarily. In the weeks that followed JonBenet's death, the authorities began to examine whether an outsider might have been responsible for the murder. Was the family's house a random target for a stranger, or was it possible that someone had been watching the Ramsey home for a long time? Investigators began questioning neighbors and examining the area surrounding the Ramsey home for any potential leads. Boulder, Colorado, was a relatively quiet and safe town, but it was possible that an intruder had been familiar with the Ramsey family and had been planning the crime for some time. One theory that gained traction was the idea that JonBenet had been kidnapped by someone who had been observing the family and knew exactly where to strike. Perhaps the kidnapper had been able to sneak into the house under the cover of darkness and take JonBenet without anyone noticing. But if this was the case, why had the kidnapper left such an obvious clue behind in the form of the ransom note? Despite the growing theory that an intruder might have been involved, there was still a distinct lack of evidence linking anyone outside the Ramsey family to the crime. No physical evidence was found at the crime scene that pointed to a third-party intruder. No fingerprints were discovered on the ransom note, and the lack of forced entry continued to be a key piece of the puzzle. It seemed impossible for a stranger to have entered the home without leaving behind some trace. While the police continued to explore these avenues, the media's focus on the Ramsey family was relentless. JonBenet's murder had quickly turned into a media circus, with tabloids, news outlets, and journalists camped outside the Ramsey home. Every move made by John and Patsy Ramsey was followed closely, and their grief was broadcast for the world to see. At times, it seemed like the press had turned the family into the main suspects, sensationalizing every detail of their personal lives in search of a scandal. As the investigation dragged on, more rumors surfaced. Some suggested that JonBenet's death was connected to a string of other unsolved child murders. Others speculated that the case could be linked to pedophiles who might have been targeting beauty pageant contestants. Given JonBenet's career in the pageant world, the media, driven by the desire for answers, turned every possibility into a theory, and every theory into a headline. The pressure on the Ramsey family was intense. They were already grieving the loss of their daughter, but now they were also dealing with the scrutiny of the media and the suspicion of the public. Their every word was analyzed, their every gesture watched. Even their decision to take a trip to the nearby church for Christmas Eve Mass was criticized. Were they trying to appear innocent, or was it simply a family trying to carry on some sense of normalcy during the worst possible time? The tension between the media, the public, and the Ramsey family continued to grow. Every new piece of information seemed to fuel more speculation, but still no answers. The questions about JonBenet's death only multiplied, and the case remained unsolved. As weeks passed, the investigation into JonBenet Ramsey's murder seemed to be spiraling in every direction. Theories multiplied, and the media frenzy reached an all-time high. With each passing day, the Ramsey family's life was further scrutinized. John and Patsy were forced to navigate the emotional devastation of losing their daughter, while also facing relentless pressure to prove their innocence. As time went on, the case became more complex and more confounding. In 1999, the investigation into JonBenét's death reached a significant moment. A grand jury was convened to examine the evidence. It was the first real attempt to bring clarity to the case, to determine whether there was enough evidence to charge anyone with JonBenét's murder. The grand jury spent months reviewing the facts, the testimonies, and the evidence. Finally, after a lengthy deliberation, the grand jury voted to indict Patsy and John Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death. The indictment, however, would never come to fruition. The district attorney in Boulder, Alex Hunter, decided not to pursue charges against the Ramseys. Despite the grand jury's recommendation, Hunter felt there was insufficient evidence to charge them with the crime. The decision to drop the indictment caused a public uproar, leading to questions about whether the authorities were too quick to rule out the Ramseys as suspects, or if they were simply trying to protect the family from further humiliation. This decision would forever stain the investigation. The idea that the Ramseys might have been involved in their daughter's death was never fully dispelled, but neither was the possibility that the true killer had been overlooked. And so, the case remained stuck in limbo, with no clear direction or resolution. In 2008, a major development in the case seemed to offer new hope. New DNA evidence, specifically a sample found on JonBenét's underwear, was examined, and it was determined that the DNA did not match any member of the Ramsey family. This was a crucial piece of evidence that further shifted the investigation away from the family and pointed to the possibility of an intruder. However, while the DNA evidence excluded the Ramseys, it didn't bring the case any closer to finding JonBenét's killer. The DNA sample did not match anyone in the national database, which meant that the killer remained unidentified. The breakthrough, while it cleared the family, also left the investigation without a clear suspect or a new direction to pursue. The hope of finding a breakthrough began to fade as the years went on, but still, investigators and members of the public clung to the idea that the truth would eventually come to light. JonBenét's death, now nearly 2 decades old, had become a symbol of frustration, of justice denied. While the DNA evidence offered some closure for the Ramsey family, it did not offer the answers that they or the public so desperately needed. As time went on, the case began to take on a life of its own. Books, documentaries, and news specials were produced, each offering new theories about what had happened to JonBenet. Some speculated that the child had been the victim of a sexual predator. Others claimed that there was a possible connection to the world of beauty pageants, with perverts targeting young girls involved in such competitions. Another theory that gained attention suggested that JonBenet had been accidentally killed by her brother, Burke. The theory, which emerged in the early 2000s, suggested that Burke had been involved in a violent altercation with JonBenet, possibly a disagreement over something trivial like food or attention, and that the blow to her head was accidental. The theory was controversial, with many rejecting it as baseless, but it remained a topic of discussion in the media for years. There were even theories that suggested JonBenet's death had been the result of a botched kidnapping attempt. Perhaps the ransom note was part of an elaborate plan to make it look like a kidnapping, but it went horribly wrong. These theories often speculated that the killer, whether a member of the family or an outsider, had been trying to cover up their involvement with the staged ransom demand. But all these theories lacked hard evidence. They were simply speculation in the face of overwhelming mystery. And so, JonBenet Ramsey's murder continued to haunt the collective consciousness of the public, a case that was never fully solved, a little girl whose death was still shrouded in secrecy. As the years went on, the murder of JonBenet Ramsey began to feel like a broken record. No matter how many times the case was revisited, no new answers seemed to emerge. Each new development in the investigation only seemed to bring more questions. Who killed JonBenet? Was it someone close to her? Someone she trusted? Or was it an intruder? A stranger who had snuck into the house and committed this heinous crime for reasons unknown? The sadness surrounding JonBenet's death never went away. For her family, the tragedy was a constant weight they carried. John and Patsy, who had endured the media's unrelenting gaze and the scrutiny of law enforcement, would never be free from the shadow of their daughter's death. Patsy Ramsey would pass away in 2006, never seeing justice for her daughter's murder. John Ramsey, still searching for answers, would continue to fight for closure, though he knew deep down that the mystery might never be solved. JonBenét's murder remains one of the most haunting and controversial cases in modern American history. It is a reminder of how deeply a family can be impacted by loss, and how, sometimes, even the best efforts of law enforcement can't uncover the truth. The questions linger. Was the killer ever caught? Will we ever know who did this to a 6-year-old girl with a bright future? Or is the truth lost in the darkness of time, forever sealed behind the walls of the Ramsey home? JonBenét's legacy lives on, but so do the unanswered questions. The world may never know who killed JonBené Ramsey, but the mystery will endure, a chilling reminder of a tragic, unsolved crime. Story 4. Ted Bundy's Killing Spree, 1970s. What if the most terrifying monster to ever walk among us wasn't a shadow lurking in the dark, but a man who could charm, deceive, and manipulate his way into your life, and then disappear without a trace? Ted Bundy's killing spree in the 1970s left at least 30 young women dead. But what's even scarier is that he was able to fool the entire world into thinking he was harmless. A handsome, intelligent law student, Bundy was the last person anyone would have suspected, until it was too late. The story of Ted Bundy isn't just about a killer. It's about the terrifying truth that evil can wear the face of someone you'd never see coming. Ted Bundy was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary man. But it is precisely this ordinariness that made him one of the most terrifying killers in U.S. history. He was the kind of man who blended seamlessly into any crowd, the kind who could be your next-door neighbor, a trusted colleague, or even a friend. Charming, well-spoken, and intelligent, Bundy was a man who could make anyone feel at ease, until, in the blink of an eye, he revealed the dark, twisted nature that lurked beneath his perfect facade. Born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, Bundy's early life was far from ideal. Raised in a single-parent home by his mother, he never knew his biological father. His mother, Louise Bundy, had moved him around frequently, and for much of his early years, he grew up believing that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. This confusion over his identity and a lack of a stable home life would shape the man he would become. But it wasn't the lack of a father figure that would define Bundy's future. It was the uncanny ability he had to manipulate and deceive those around him. It started small, innocent lies here and there, a little charm to get what he wanted. But it quickly escalated into something darker, something far more sinister. By the early 1970s, Bundy was already on his way to becoming one of the most infamous serial killers in the world. In 1974, he began his killing spree. A spree that would stretch across several states and last for years. But what made Bundy so dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill. It was his ability to blend in, to be someone no one would ever suspect. He was the man people trusted. It wasn't long before Bundy's charm became a weapon. He knew exactly how to make women feel comfortable, how to lull them into a false sense of security. His first known victims were young women who disappeared in the early 1970s, primarily in the Pacific Northwest. But the way he stalked his victims was calculated, meticulous, almost clinical. In January 1974, Bundy kidnapped his first victim, 18-year-old Barbara Bobby Parks, from a shopping mall parking lot in Washington state. It was the perfect crime. No witnesses, no immediate suspects. Bundy lured her to his car under the guise of needing help, and once she was inside, he subdued her. It wasn't just the physical act of kidnapping that Bundy mastered. It was his ability to put the victim at ease, to gain their trust in a matter of moments. He had a way of speaking, of moving, that made him seem harmless, like a man just passing through, never someone to fear. But Bundy was not a man passing through. He was a predator, and for the next few years, his spree would unfold in a horrific pattern of violence. His next victims came just months after Parks' disappearance. The attacks were rapid, each one eerily similar to the last. Bundy's method was horrifying in its simplicity. lure a woman into his car, incapacitate her, take her to a secluded location, and then, in a calm, controlled manner, carry out his sick fantasies. He didn't stop at simply killing these women. Bundy was calculated, his every move designed to evade suspicion. He would often strike at night in public places, college campuses, parking lots, or secluded paths. He was patient and methodical, learning from each encounter, refining his technique. He could even return to the crime scene the following day, ensuring that there was no sign of a struggle, no hint of violence, at least not outwardly. As Bundy's killing spree continued, his behavior grew even more disturbing. His crimes became more brutal, more violent. What started as a methodical pattern of abductions quickly escalated into something far more sinister. In many cases, Bundy's victims were found sexually assaulted, often mutilated in ways that suggested deep psychological torment. Bundy's escalation was not only physical but also psychological. He began to experiment with different ways of luring his victims, using tools like crutches or fake injuries to make himself seem vulnerable. These ploys allowed him to disarm women's suspicions, tricking them into helping him. But once inside his car or isolated with him, they were at his mercy. Each new victim brought Bundy closer to his ultimate goal. Not just to kill, but to dominate. He wanted complete control over his victims, and with every murder, he honed his ability to manipulate, to deceive, to get exactly what he wanted without anyone suspecting a thing. What made Bundy so dangerous was not just his ability to kill, it was the way he controlled the narrative. The people closest to him, his friends, his girlfriend, even law enforcement, believed in him. Bundy was the kind of person who could charm anyone, who could manipulate those around him with ease. He was smart, charismatic, and able to blend into any situation. He wasn't just a killer. He was an actor, playing his part in a twisted game that no one else even knew existed. He would eventually claim to have killed more than 30 women across 7 states, but police would only officially link him to 30 murders. Bundy's ability to slip through the cracks of law enforcement only added to his terror. Unlike other killers, who might have committed their crimes in one location or left behind significant evidence, Bundy moved. He didn't limit himself to a single state or a single method. He was a nomad of death, a chameleon who blended into every part of society he entered. Even after his arrest in 1975, Bundy was a master of manipulation. He charmed prison guards and even fellow inmates, maintaining the same mask of normalcy that had allowed him to hide in plain sight for so long. Bundy's charm wasn't just a personality trait, it was a weapon. He used it to escape suspicion, to evade justice for years, and to continue his killing spree with impunity. What made Bundy's killing spree particularly chilling wasn't just the number of women he murdered. It was how calculated and controlled his actions were. There was a disturbing coldness to his crimes. Bundy didn't act out of frenzy. He acted with cold, detached logic. Each murder was methodical, each step carefully planned. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to control, to break down the boundaries between victim and predator, to erase all trace of his involvement. As he moved from state to state, from victim to victim, Bundy grew more confident. He was a man who understood the system and used it to his advantage. He knew how to lie, how to manipulate. He was a master at evading the authorities, and his intelligence made him a formidable adversary for anyone trying to catch him. Ted Bundy's spree of terror was unlike any the country had seen before. His ability to remain hidden in plain sight, his calculated nature, and his terrifying charm made him one of the most dangerous serial killers in U.S. history. His story is not just one of murder and violence, but of manipulation, deception, and a chilling ability to convince people that he was someone they could trust. Bundy's killing spree would forever change the landscape of criminal investigation and would leave a legacy of fear and intrigue that still haunts the nation today. Ted Bundy's killing spree wasn't just random violence. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of death. His charm, his calculated behavior, and his ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement turned every murder into a twisted puzzle. By the mid-1970s, his actions had become more frequent, and the terror he instilled had begun to spread far beyond the quiet corners of the Pacific Northwest. Bundy didn't follow a single pattern. but rather an evolving, ever-adapting strategy. It was almost as if he relished the thrill of the hunt, like a predator who learned with every kill how to better trap his prey. The most unsettling part? He wasn't just a serial killer, he was a master manipulator, and the control he exerted over his victims before taking their lives was as chilling as the crimes themselves. What made Bundy particularly terrifying was how he preyed on young women with a method that was both subtle and terrifyingly efficient. He didn't need a weapon at first. His most dangerous weapon was his appearance. A charming, handsome young man, often dressed neatly, his demeanor disarmingly polite. He would often fake injuries, feign helplessness, or use other ruses to lure his victims in. A crutch, a cast, a broken arm. These were all tools Bundy used to gain his victims' trust. He was a predator who knew exactly what to say, how to look, and when to strike. His appearance was disarming enough that he could easily ask for help in broad daylight, and those who helped him often did so with no hesitation. He would often approach his victims in public places, parks, or university campuses, blending into the normal rhythm of daily life, unnoticed by those around him. His charm was his first weapon, but the real horror was what happened once he got them alone. It would take mere minutes to lure a woman into his car. Once they were inside, Bundy would quickly overpower them, rendering them helpless before they even realized what had happened. His calm, almost methodical approach made him feel like nothing more than a regular man, until it was too late. Once inside the vehicle, the terror would escalate. He didn't just kill, he controlled. His victims were often physically restrained, kept at his mercy in isolated locations, where he would satisfy his dark urges. His physical assault was often preceded by brutal psychological manipulation. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to make his victims fear him, to break them down. He would inflict pain in a controlled manner, lingering with an eerie calmness that made each act of violence even more horrifying. As Bundy's killing spree continued across several states, a chilling pattern began to emerge. His victims were almost always young, attractive women, often college students. His attacks had a consistent brutality that hinted at a disturbing fixation. Bundy didn't just want to take the lives of his victims. He wanted to dominate them, to strip away their dignity in the most gruesome way imaginable. His ritualistic nature suggested something more profound than just murder. It suggested a desire to control, to possess, and ultimately to erase. In some cases, Bundy would return to the scenes of his crimes, visiting the bodies of his victims, reenacting his killings, and satisfying his depraved need for power and control. The violence was not spur of the moment. It was premeditated, cold, and deliberate. His crimes were not just acts of passion or rage. They were a means of asserting dominance over women, an act of evil executed with chilling precision. But Bundy didn't stop there. He began to take souvenirs, a habit that would become a hallmark of his spree. He would steal personal items from his victims, jewelry, clothing, sometimes even parts of their bodies. These mementos weren't just trophies. They were a way for Bundy to keep his victims with him, to maintain the illusion of control long after they had died. The fact that he could leave a trail of bodies in his wake and still walk freely among society speaks to the degree of his manipulation and the chilling way in which he had honed his craft. As Bundy's reign of terror continued across state lines, law enforcement officials began to recognize the similarities between the murders. His method, though always evolving, bore striking resemblances in every case. But despite the growing pattern, Bundy's ability to blend in meant that he was nearly invisible to the public and law enforcement alike. It was 1975 when the first real breakthrough came. A police officer in Utah, Officer Bob Hayward, pulled over a car for a routine stop, unaware that he had just made the most significant arrest in the case of the most elusive serial killer in American history. Bundy's car matched the description of a vehicle seen near the scene of a recent kidnapping, and as the officer approached, he noticed that Bundy seemed suspiciously calm, almost too composed for someone caught in the act of something so serious. Inside the car, the officer found burglary tools and ski masks, items that raised immediate red flags. This arrest would eventually lead to Bundy's first trial. The connection between Bundy and the recent wave of disappearances became clear, and police finally had the chance to question him. But even in custody, Bundy remained eerily calm. He was confident, almost smug characteristics that only made his terrifying nature all the more apparent. At first, Bundy was the picture of the charming, unassuming man. His intelligence and ability to speak with authority made it easy to believe he was innocent. He quickly began to manipulate his interrogators, using his charisma to try and convince them of his innocence. But as more evidence came to light, including items belonging to victims found in his car and details that matched the modus operandi of his earlier murders, Bundy's facade began to crack. By the time Bundy was linked to multiple murders, it was too late to stop the horror. His calculated nature and ability to hide in plain sight had allowed him to operate with relative impunity for far too long. But even then, he remained arrogant, still believing that he could outsmart the law and escape justice. Bundy's arrest, while a victory for law enforcement, was far from the end of the terror he inspired. Even in prison, he continued to manipulate those around him. His charm wasn't limited to his victims. It extended to his fellow inmates and even the prison guards. His charismatic personality, coupled with his intelligence, made him a captivating figure, even as he was locked away for his crimes. It wasn't just his outward charm that made Bundy terrifying. It was his ability to play everyone around him, to create false narratives and confuse anyone who tried to understand him. In 1977, while in prison, Bundy managed to escape. His cunning and ability to think several steps ahead made him a dangerous man, even in captivity. For a time, he evaded recapture, continuing his spree in Florida, where he attacked and murdered even more victims. The fact that he was able to escape and then resume his killing spree demonstrated the terrifying power he wielded over those who crossed his path. It was only after his capture again that Bundy's reign of terror came to an end. He was eventually convicted of numerous murders and sentenced to death. But even as he faced his trial, he maintained an almost eerie level of control over his own narrative, continuing to manipulate and deceive everyone around him. Ted Bundy's story is not just the tale of a serial killer. It's the story of a man who used his charm, intelligence, and manipulative behavior to disguise his true nature, fooling everyone in his path. His killing spree was not just a series of random murders, but a terrifying game of control, a game that he played with alarming precision. Bundy's ability to blend in, to be seen as a normal, even likable person, made him the perfect predator. His intelligence allowed him to outthink his victims and, for a time, outsmart the authorities. But it was the darkness that lay behind his charm that makes Bundy's legacy so chilling. Ted Bundy wasn't just a killer. He was a man who mastered the art of deception. And it is this chilling fact that makes his story so terrifying. That someone so intelligent, so charismatic, could hide such evil beneath the surface, undetected for so long. Ted Bundy had always believed he was smarter than the authorities. For years, he had slipped through their fingers, escaping justice with his charm, intelligence, and ability to manipulate everyone around him. But as the 1970s drew to a close, the inevitable happened. Bundy's reign of terror came to an end. In 1977, after being incarcerated in Utah for the kidnapping of Carol Duranch, Bundy managed to pull off what would become one of his most audacious escapes. He had been sentenced to a prison term but remained convinced that he could outwit the system. Bundy's first escape came in a way that showcased his unsettling calmness and chilling creativity. He had been working on his escape plan for months, even though the authorities believed he was securely locked away. The first escape was a simple one. He crawled through a hole he had created in the ceiling of his cell. It was only a matter of time before he slipped out unnoticed, finding his way into the night. Bundy was free once again. For a while, no one knew where he had gone, and he had the freedom to plan his next moves. He vanished into the night, moving across state lines, slipping into Florida, where he would commit his most brutal murders yet. Bundy's escape was just the beginning of his final, horrifying chapter. As soon as he arrived in Florida, he began to re-establish his killing spree with a sickening new intensity. In January 1978, Bundy attacked two women, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, at Florida State University. Both were raped, brutalized, and murdered in a manner so horrific that it sent a shockwave through the campus. But Bundy's control over his killings had evolved even further. He had refined his methods to a frightening degree. He didn't just kill, he relished the torture, the fear, and the absolute power he held over his victims. They were his puppets, and he had become an expert at pulling their strings. With the murders piling up, law enforcement had no choice but to take a closer look at Bundy. Florida investigators, now fully aware of Bundy's pattern of crimes, linked the brutal attacks to the man who had been able to slip past their grasp for so long. His ability to remain hidden in plain sight, even in the face of mounting evidence, had been staggering. In February of 1978, Bundy's luck ran out. He was pulled over by a police officer in Pensacola, Florida. At first, the officer had no idea who he was stopping. Bundy, with his calm demeanor and charisma, was just another motorist, until the officer ran a check on his vehicle. In the car, Bundy had some suspicious items, tools, ski masks, and a crowbar, all of which were consistent with the way he had abducted his victims. He was arrested on the spot, and the authorities finally had the man they had been hunting for so long. Bundy's arrest in 1978 was a moment of both triumph and horror for law enforcement. His capture didn't just end a spree, it ended an era of terror. The quiet, charming man who had murdered without remorse had been caught, but the crimes he committed still echoed in the lives of the families left behind. Ted Bundy was a man who thrived in the spotlight. The trial that followed his arrest in Florida became one of the most publicized and sensationalized legal battles in U.S. history. Bundy's charm was still present. He defended himself, choosing to represent himself in court, and used every opportunity to play to the media. He was calm, confident, and still manipulated the entire courtroom into thinking he was merely a man wrongly accused. Throughout the trial, Bundy maintained his innocence, and despite the overwhelming evidence, he never broke down. His calculated demeanor shocked everyone, from the prosecutors to the jurors. He even tried to use his charm to seduce women in the courtroom, drawing attention from the press and the public. It was clear that, even in his downfall, Bundy had mastered the art of deception. But the evidence was undeniable. Bundy's connection to the crimes was as clear as day. Hair samples found on the bodies of the victims matched Bundy's. Items belonging to the victims had been found in his car, and forensic evidence tied him to the scene of each murder. There was no escaping the truth, but Bundy still tried. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Bundy's charm was not enough to save him. The evidence against him was overwhelming. In 1979, Ted Bundy was convicted of the brutal murders of two women in Florida, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. His trial for other murders across multiple states was just beginning, but this conviction would seal his fate. While awaiting trial for other murders, Bundy continued to manipulate and deceive those around him. But as his death sentence loomed, something changed in him. He finally confessed. Bundy admitted to killing at least 30 women, but investigators believed the true number of his victims could be much higher. His confession was chilling and disturbing, not just for the heinous acts he described, but for the way he recounted them with cold detachment, as if he were simply telling a story rather than recounting his own atrocities. In the months leading up to his execution, Bundy offered details about his killings that only he could have known. He talked about his method of luring women, his need for control, and the satisfaction he found in the act of murder. Bundy claimed that his compulsion was driven by a deep psychological need for power, and that the only way he could satisfy his urges was through violent domination. The confessions, however, did not provide the answers that some had hoped for. Bundy was never able to give a full explanation for why he did what he did, nor did he reveal all of his victims. The true extent of his crimes remained a mystery, and it would die with him. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed by electric chair in Florida State Prison. His final words, before being strapped into the chair, were a mixture of defiance and indifference. "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." He died at 7:16 p.m., ending one of the most terrifying killing sprees in history. Bundy's execution was met with mixed reactions. To some, It was a long overdue end to a man who had caused unimaginable pain. To others, it was a reminder of the evil that could exist within the most unassuming individuals. Bundy's charm, his intelligence, and his manipulative behavior had allowed him to live a double life. A life that was both terrifying and bewildering. Ted Bundy left behind a legacy of fear and intrigue. His killing spree spanned 7 states and lasted over 4 years. But it was the chilling nature of his crimes. The way he deceived, charmed, and controlled his victims that has made him an icon of true crime. Bundy didn't just kill. He dominated, manipulated, and broke his victims down in ways that still haunt the world to this day. Bundy's story is one of pure evil, hidden behind a mask of normalcy and charm. He wasn't a monster that lived in the shadows. He was a monster who walked among us, hiding in plain sight, fooling everyone. And while his death ended his killing spree, the terror he instilled remains. Story 5. The Murder of Kitty Genovese. What if I told you that, in the midst of a brutal murder, 38 people stood by, hearing a woman scream for her life and did nothing? On a cold night in 1964, Kitty Genovese was brutally attacked outside her New York apartment. But the shocking part isn't just her death. It's the fact that dozens of neighbors watched, listened, and stayed silent, too paralyzed by fear or indifference to intervene. Her murder didn't just change the course of a life. It sparked a chilling new psychological phenomenon, known as the bystander effect, that reveals just how deep our apathy can run when others are around. What happens to us in the face of someone else's pain? Kitty's tragedy would force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The more people who witness an emergency, the less likely anyone is to act. The night of March 13, 1964, began like any other in Kew Gardens, a quiet neighborhood in Queens, New York. Kitty Genovese, a 28-year-old bar manager, had just finished her late shift at a local tavern. The walk home, a routine she had followed countless times, should have been uneventful. The streets were lit, the air chilly but crisp, and her apartment was only a few blocks away. But tonight would be different. It would be a night that would forever change the way we understand human nature, fear, and apathy. Kitty was walking down Austin Street when she was first attacked. A man approached her from behind, grabbed her, and forced her to the ground. She screamed, loud and desperate, calling out for help. Her cries pierced the night air, but as she struggled, something strange happened. No one came. Kitty fought back fiercely, kicking and screaming, hoping someone would hear her and intervene. She managed to break free and ran towards the safety of her apartment building. But the man was relentless. He followed her, catching up with her just a few steps from the door. She screamed again, pleading for her life. This time, the attacker stabbed her in the back, and she collapsed to the ground. Still, the silence from the surrounding apartments was deafening. Unbeknownst to Kitty, as she lay there in the cold, struggling to breathe, dozens of people were watching from the windows of nearby buildings. At least 38 individuals, neighbors, passers-by, and strangers, heard her screams, saw the violent assault unfold from their windows, but none of them stepped forward to help. None of them called the police. They watched from the safety of their homes, perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps frightened, but never acting. The attacker, now certain that Kitty was on the brink of death, retreated briefly, perhaps to consider what to do next. Kitty, weak from blood loss and unable to defend herself further, tried to crawl towards the safety of her apartment building once more. But the killer returned, stabbing her repeatedly in the back and leaving her for dead. By the time the police were finally called, it was far too late. Kitty Genovese had died in the cold, alone on the sidewalk, just feet from her apartment. What happened that night should have been an ordinary tragedy, an isolated crime, a solitary victim, and a violent killer. But what came after was anything but ordinary. In the days following her murder, an investigation was launched, and the truth began to unfold. The crime hadn't happened in secret. It had happened under the eyes of a community, 38 people to be exact, each of whom had witnessed the crime unfold in real time. The police investigation revealed that no one had called the police during the 30 minutes that Kitty was attacked. Not once. No one tried to intervene. Some witnesses reported hearing her screams, but they assumed someone else had already called the authorities. Others simply didn't want to get involved. The disturbing conclusion was undeniable. Kitty Genovese had been murdered in full view of the public, and no one had stepped forward to stop it. The news of the murder sent shockwaves through the nation. The public was horrified, but the shock didn't just come from the brutality of the crime. It came from the eerie silence that had accompanied it. How could 38 people watch a woman being brutally attacked and not lift a finger to help? How could no one have called the police? The case seemed like a grim reflection of a society that had become numb to human suffering. The murder became a national scandal, and the ensuing outcry forced sociologists and psychologists to ask uncomfortable questions about human behavior. Why had no one helped? What kind of society allows such cruelty to unfold without a single person intervening? The public outcry was palpable, and it led to a wave of studies aimed at understanding the behavior of bystanders in emergency situations. Researchers would soon identify the phenomenon as the bystander effect, a chilling concept that would reshape how we view human empathy and intervention. The bystander effect, as it came to be known, is the psychological phenomenon in which individuals are less likely to help a victim in distress when other people are present. The theory suggests that the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely any one of them is to intervene. The rationale behind this is simple. When others are present, people feel less personal responsibility. They assume that someone else will take action, that someone else will make the call, or that someone else will be the hero. Kitty's murder exposed this horrifying dynamic in its most extreme form. The details of what transpired on that night raised countless questions. Were the neighbors simply indifferent? Did they not care? Or was it something more insidious? A paralysis of fear, a collective shrug, an unwillingness to get involved? Were they waiting for someone else to take responsibility? The fact that so many had witnessed the attack but no one acted was baffling and deeply unsettling. Researchers began to study the behavior of bystanders in emergency situations, looking for patterns and explanations. They conducted experiments, testing how people react when they are alone versus when they are in a group. The results were staggering. People were far less likely to help when others were present. The more witnesses there were, the less likely someone was to take action. This social phenomenon seemed to transcend all boundaries of class, race, and geography. The Kitty Genovese case became the cornerstone of this research, and it left an indelible mark on social psychology. It raised disturbing questions about human nature. Was it human instinct to turn away from suffering, to be paralyzed by the presence of others? Had society become so disconnected that individuals would rather avoid involvement, even in the face of a woman's desperate cries for help? Even today, the murder of Kitty Genovese remains one of the most haunting and tragic examples of human indifference. The questions surrounding her death have never fully been answered. Were the witnesses truly apathetic, or was it something deeper, something more ingrained in the psychology of human behavior? Was it a matter of fear, confusion, or simple inaction? There were even questions about the nature of the initial reports. Some neighbors claimed that they had not heard Kitty's screams, or that they had not fully understood the situation. Some claimed that they had thought someone else had called the police. Others did come forward, but by the time they did, it was already too late. In the confusion, no one stepped up in time. The sense of community that should have prevailed in such a crisis seemed to have vanished, replaced by fear, uncertainty, and a failure to act. The aftermath of the murder was not just a loss of a life, it was the loss of humanity in a moment of intense need. Kitty Genovese's death highlighted a cruel truth. In the presence of others, people often become passive, waiting for someone else to act, to intervene. The murder would forever change the way we saw ourselves in relation to one another. Kitty Genovese's death was a tragedy that shocked the world, but it was also the catalyst for a broader cultural shift. Her story forced society to confront a painful truth, that we can no longer afford to ignore suffering, especially when it's happening right in front of us. The bystander effect became a vital concept in psychology, leading to changes in how people are taught to respond to emergencies. Her murder sparked reforms in law enforcement procedures, community outreach, and social psychology, forcing us to ask how we could break the cycle of passivity. How could we make sure that people act when someone else's life is at risk? Kitty's death, while tragic, also gave rise to an awareness that changed the way people view their responsibility to others. It is no longer enough to stand by in the face of tragedy. We are all called to act. Her story remains a painful reminder that inaction in the face of suffering is a choice that we must refuse to make if we are ever to break free from the paralyzing grip of indifference. The murder of Kitty Genovese changed more than the psychology of bystanders. It changed the very fabric of how we perceive community, empathy, and responsibility. What started as a brutal crime on the quiet streets of Queens soon rippled outward, leaving a scar in the collective consciousness of a society forced to confront its own apathy. What had been a simple murder investigation slowly morphed into something much darker, a deep, uncomfortable look at the human condition. The story of Kitty's death would haunt not just the people who stood by and did nothing, but a society that had failed her in the most profound way. It was a failure of humanity, a failure of empathy that transcended her tragedy, stretching its fingers into the everyday lives of people all around the world. As the details of the case spread across the media, the public was gripped by disbelief. 38 witnesses, 38 people who had seen or heard the attack unfold, and yet none of them intervened. None of them picked up the phone to call for help. None of them rushed to her side, even as the man who attacked her continued his savage assault, returned to finish the job, and left her lifeless on the sidewalk. The media's portrayal of the neighbors who witnessed the murder added another layer of horror. Their inaction was not just passive, it was terrifyingly collective. The belief that someone else would do something permeated the minds of everyone who stood by, trapped by a shared psychological burden. They didn't act, not because they were incapable of compassion, but because the very presence of others made it easier to do nothing. And the nation, watching the news unfold, felt a collective gut punch. People began to ask themselves, what would I have done? Could they, too, have ignored a desperate cry for help? Could they, too, have been paralyzed by the same social forces, the same internal hesitation? The public outrage was immediate. People were furious, confused, and above all, terrified. But this wasn't a terror of the killer alone. It was a terror about the system we had all come to rely on. A system of shared responsibility. A belief that, in times of need, we could count on those around us. But what if we couldn't? What if, in the face of real human suffering, our collective safety net was nothing more than a mirage? Kitty Genovese's murder was a tragedy on a personal level. A young woman, full of life, with a future ahead of her, violently taken in an instant. But beyond her death, the psychological and social ramifications were just as profound. The legacy of Kitty's murder would not just be one of criminal justice or police procedure. It would be a stark reminder of what happens when we collectively fail to act in the face of distress. For those who witnessed Kitty's murder, the emotional toll was immense. They would never escape the images of her final moments, the haunting memory of her desperate cries for help that went unanswered. They would spend the rest of their lives asking themselves the same painful question: could I have saved her? Their own guilt was compounded by the fact that, as much as they wanted to rationalize their lack of action, they could not escape the truth. They had all done nothing, and in doing so, they had become a part of the crime itself. The psychological burden of that realization would haunt them forever. Psychologists and social theorists began to examine the emotional consequences for the witnesses. Some reported feelings of shame and guilt, while others exhibited a chilling numbness. There was a shared discomfort, an unease about the capacity for evil in everyone, that only intensified as the case unfolded. What did it say about us as human beings when we allowed something so horrific to happen right before our eyes? The national outrage over Kitty's murder gave rise to a powerful movement for change, both in terms of how we understood human behavior and how we approached the concept of collective responsibility. The outcry over the lack of intervention became the catalyst for societal reforms aimed at addressing the failure of bystanders to act. Lawmakers began discussing new emergency response systems, and public service campaigns aimed at encouraging people to call for help in emergency situations emerged. Kitty's death forced us to ask not just how to respond when we are the victim, but how to respond when we see someone else suffering. Public awareness grew, and so did the understanding that the problem wasn't just about the individual, it was about society as a whole. How could we shift from a culture of indifference to one of collective action? How could we teach ourselves and future generations that doing nothing in the face of suffering was no longer acceptable? While the crime itself was horrifying, it was the profound social consequence that lingered. The bystander effect had not just been a psychological phenomenon, it had been a moral one. A society that stood silent in the face of cruelty was a society that had lost its sense of compassion. Kitty Genovese's death, while tragic, had forced a reckoning that sparked a movement toward changing the way we respond to emergencies. Despite all the academic studies, public campaigns, and social reforms, Kitty Genovese's death remains one of the most haunting examples of human inaction in history. The bystander effect is now a cornerstone of social psychology, studied and understood, but still a painful reminder of the limits of human empathy. Kitty's name has become a symbol of that dark moment in time, the moment when the conscience of society failed. But it is also a symbol of the ability to change. Since her murder, we have learned to be more vigilant, more responsible for one another, more aware of the consequences of our silence. And yet, the question remains, can we ever really change? When faced with danger, with suffering, will we step in, or will we freeze, waiting for someone else to take action? The true test of humanity, of a society, lies not in what we say but in how we act when it counts. Kitty Genovese's legacy lives on as both a tragedy and a call to action. It asks of us the most uncomfortable question. What are we willing to do when someone's life is on the line? Her story is a dark mirror held up to each of us, a chilling reminder that in moments of crisis, the silence we choose to accept can be as deadly as the crime itself. Story 6. The disappearance of the Sodder children. What if I told you that on Christmas Eve, in a house engulfed by flames, 5 children were supposed to have died, but their bodies were never found? The fire that devastated the Sodder family home in 1945 seemed like an open-and-shut tragedy, but then strange, eerie details began to emerge. The fire was too perfect, the circumstances too strange, and the evidence too confusing. What if the children weren't victims of the blaze at all? What if they were taken before the fire even started? The mystery of the Sodder children's disappearance has haunted West Virginia for decades, and to this day, no one knows what really happened that night. It was Christmas Eve, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The Sodder family, George, Jenny, and their 10 children, were celebrating the holiday in their modest but well-loved home. The house, perched on a hillside, was warmly lit by the glow of Christmas decorations, a home filled with the sounds of laughter, holiday cheer, and the promise of a joyful Christmas morning. But that night, as the family went to bed, a disaster that would leave a haunting mark on the town and the nation was just about to unfold. What began as a peaceful evening of holiday tradition would soon unravel into one of the most bizarre and chilling disappearances in American history. Around 1 a.m., the Sodder family was awoken by a phone call. Jenny Sodder answered the phone, but there was only silence on the other end. Thinking it was a prank, she hung up. It was the first of many strange and unsettling occurrences that night. Moments later, George and Jenny were awakened again, this time by the smell of smoke. Jenny rushed to check on the children, but the house was filled with smoke, and the smell of burning wood was overpowering. George quickly ran to the children's rooms to get them out, but when he reached the stairs, the house was already engulfed in flames. The fire spread quickly, consuming the house from the bottom up. In those first terrifying moments, it seemed almost like an unstoppable force. George and Jenny managed to escape with 4 of their children, but 5 others were still trapped inside. As the fire raged on, the family watched helplessly, praying that their children would somehow find a way out. But as the fire department arrived and the fire was finally extinguished, there was no sign of the 5 missing children. The charred remains of the house told a terrifying story. The destruction had been so complete that even the walls had been scorched beyond recognition. Yet, there was something that didn't make sense. Despite the intensity of the flames, there were no bodies. The fire had burned so fiercely, yet there was no trace of the children who had been trapped inside. It seemed impossible, a detail that was too strange to ignore. As the fire department combed through the wreckage, they found little evidence of what had happened to the children. No remains, no traces of the children's belongings, nothing that would explain how 5 children could simply disappear into thin air. The fire was so intense, so devastating, that it should have consumed everything in its path. Yet, the bodies of the 5 children who had been sleeping in their rooms that night were nowhere to be found. From the very beginning, something about the fire didn't add up. The fire had been incredibly hot and destructive. Yet there were no bodies, no remains, no clothing, no personal items from the missing children found among the wreckage. To anyone with even the smallest bit of knowledge about fires, this was an anomaly. The family was told that the intense heat of the blaze had likely incinerated the children's bodies completely, an explanation that seemed far too convenient for many. But George and Jenny, already devastated by the loss of their children, couldn't accept it. They began to ask questions. Why was there no trace of the children? If the fire had been so hot, why hadn't the other children, who had escaped, been seriously harmed? Why had the fire department not been able to find any remains? As the investigation into the fire continued, strange details began to emerge. Neighbors reported seeing a car parked near the house in the days leading up to the fire, an unfamiliar car that no one could explain. Even more disturbing, several people said they had seen a man lurking around the property, watching the house for days before the fire. Jenny Sauter became convinced that something sinister had taken place, that the fire was no accident, that her children had been taken. She began to suspect that her 5 children had been kidnapped before the fire had even started, and that the flames had been set deliberately to cover up the crime. The more the Sauters investigated, the more they were convinced that the fire had been intentionally set. George and Jenny soon discovered that their suspicions weren't unfounded. They uncovered new information that only deepened the mystery. Several witnesses claimed to have seen a man near their property shortly before the fire, acting suspiciously. A man, wearing a dark suit, was reportedly seen standing on the side of the road and looking toward the house. Some said he had been trying to stop traffic earlier that evening. Then George made a chilling discovery. The phone line had been cut the night of the fire, just hours before the blaze started. This discovery seemed to confirm that someone had intentionally set the fire. But why? And who could have done it? The family's suspicions grew when they learned that the fire department's investigation had been unusually rushed. Evidence wasn't properly examined, and no one had bothered to check for signs of foul play. The fire was deemed an accident, and the case was closed. But George and Jenny wouldn't let it go. They hired private investigators to dig deeper into what had happened that night. They uncovered more strange details. Most notably, the fact that one of the children's schoolmates had seen a man trying to coax one of the Sauter children into a car earlier that day. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that they were dealing with something far more sinister than a simple house fire. But as the days and months dragged on, no new answers emerged. The police had no leads, and the fire department's investigation had been lackluster at best. Kitty, their last hope for answers, had become a ghost, a memory, a figure trapped in a house of lies. As the years passed, the Sauters became obsessed with finding their missing children. Despite all the evidence they had uncovered and the persistent questions they had raised, the case of the missing Sauter children went cold. Every new lead, every new discovery, seemed to raise more questions than answers. They placed advertisements in newspapers, hoping that someone might come forward with information about their missing children, but no one ever did. Despite their relentless efforts, the mystery of what happened to the 5 Sauter children remained unsolved. In 1952, the Sauter family received a letter from someone claiming to have knowledge of their children's fate. The letter included a photo of 5 children who appeared remarkably similar to the missing Sauters. But the photo was never verified, and the mystery only deepened. As years turned into decades, the pain of the loss never eased for George and Jenny. They would never stop searching for their children, but the answers they longed for were elusive, hiding in the smoke and ruins of that tragic night. To this day, the fate of the Sauter children remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. Was the fire really an accident? Were the children kidnapped before the blaze, as George and Jenny believed? Or was there another, darker force at work that night, one that has never been fully understood? For decades, the case of the missing Sauter children has haunted West Virginia, and the mystery continues to captivate the imagination of those who hear their story. Was it a crime gone horribly wrong, or a twisted plan that no one has ever fully uncovered? The Sauter family's search for answers may have ended, but the questions still linger. And the mystery of what happened to those 5 children on Christmas Eve in 1945 is far from over. As the months dragged on, the pain of losing 5 children in a fire had not faded for George and Jenny Sauter. It had grown sharper, more excruciating. Each day without answers was a wound that never healed. But as the shock wore off, a burning resolve took hold of them. They would not rest until they knew the truth, until they could find their children or understand what had happened that Christmas Eve. George, a proud and determined man, became relentless in his quest. He didn't just accept the fire department's conclusions or the police's indifferent dismissal of the case. He began to dig deeper, uncovering clues that seemed to lead him into even darker corners of mystery. Every piece of information he gathered, no matter how small, only fueled his determination further. But with each passing day, the answers grew even more elusive. The first and most glaring inconsistency was the absence of the children's bodies. In a typical house fire, the bodies of victims, though severely burned, would remain identifiable. But in the case of the Sauter children, there were no remains. The house had been destroyed, yes, but it wasn't the kind of fire that would incinerate everything. It had been intense, but not enough to completely eliminate the presence of human bodies. That fact alone gnawed at George and Jenny's minds. Where were the bodies? George, after learning that there were no remains found in the ashes, took matters into his own hands. He tried to gather details from the fire department's investigation, but was met with vague explanations and rushed conclusions. As the years passed, the authorities continued to insist that the children had perished in the fire, their bodies consumed by the flames. But George refused to believe it. He knew his children had been alive when the fire started, and he knew deep down that something didn't add up. The fire chief, whose investigation had been minimal at best, had mentioned that the heat of the fire was too great to leave behind any evidence. Yet George could see from the charred remnants of the house that it wasn't the inferno they described. No traces of the children's clothing had been found. No fragments of bones. Nothing. George and Jenny were now convinced. Their children hadn't been killed in that fire. They had been taken. But by whom and why? Then came a piece of evidence so chilling that it only deepened the mystery. A woman who lived nearby, who had seen the fire from a distance, reported something strange in the hours before the blaze started. She had seen a strange car parked near the house earlier in the day, a vehicle that didn't belong in the neighborhood. And the night of the fire, there had been odd happenings. She heard someone on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. Who would have been calling the house at that hour? George wondered aloud to Jenny. They had both been woken earlier that night by a strange phone call, which had seemed like a prank. A call with no one on the other end. Had it been someone trying to lure their children out? Were the kids taken before the fire had even begun? This detail stuck in their minds like a splinter, driving them to investigate further. The phone call, the strange car, the eerie silence surrounding the fire. It was all too perfect. What if the fire wasn't an accident at all? What if the children were abducted first, and the fire was set to cover up the crime? Every theory, every lead, raised even more troubling questions. As the months dragged into years, the Sodder family's investigation grew more desperate. It wasn't until 1952, 7 years after the fire, that they received a letter that would reignite their hope. The letter came from a stranger, someone who claimed to have information about the children's fate. The man who wrote the letter was anonymous, but he included a photograph, an old photograph of 5 children, standing together, clearly older than the Sodder children had been in 1945. But the resemblance was striking. The letter suggested that the children were alive and being held somewhere, possibly in another state. The image, showing children that closely resembled their missing kids, was both a revelation and a nightmare. The mystery seemed to take another twisted turn. Had the children somehow survived the fire? Had they been taken by someone who had planned it all along? Despite the disturbing possibilities, George was more convinced than ever that something sinister had taken place. The photo was a final piece of the puzzle, showing him what he feared most. His children had been stolen, their lives destroyed in a scheme he couldn't yet comprehend. Jenny stared at the photograph for hours, comparing it to pictures of her own children. There was no denying the resemblance. They were their children, but why hadn't they come home? Why had they been taken and hidden from them for so long? The days following the receipt of the letter only served to deepen the confusion. The police were of little help, insisting that the case was closed and that the children had died in the fire. But the Sodders weren't ready to let go of their search for the truth. Every new lead that George uncovered, every new piece of evidence, only seemed to push him further into a labyrinth of confusion. By now, the idea that the children had been kidnapped and the fire was a cover-up was no longer a theory. It had become George's belief. But no one could confirm it. The fire department had failed to investigate thoroughly, and the evidence left behind was too fragmented to piece together a coherent story. The authorities seemed to have no interest in digging deeper. The pain of their loss was compounded by the fact that no one was taking their questions seriously. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, the investigation seemed to be shut down entirely. The authorities' final stance was that the fire had indeed taken the lives of their children, and no further action would be taken. The lack of closure, the unanswered questions, were more than George and Jenny could bear. The mysterious car, the phone call, the letter, all of it seemed like a cruel game, one they couldn't escape. The years wore on, and the mystery of the Sodder children's disappearance remained unsolved. George and Jenny never stopped searching, though. Their lives had been shattered, and the fire that destroyed their home had become more than a tragedy. It had become a symbol of their endless grief. Every unanswered question, every strange lead, had become a weight they carried daily. Their quest for answers had consumed them, driven them into the unknown. The more they discovered, the further the mystery seemed to stretch, always just out of reach. They would spend the rest of their lives searching for the truth, forever haunted by the absence of the 5 children they had lost on that fateful Christmas Eve. The disappearance of the Sodder children would remain one of the most bizarre and haunting mysteries in American history. As the years passed, it faded into the background of forgotten stories, but for the Sodders, it was their living nightmare. A tragedy without closure, a haunting puzzle with no solution. And so, the mystery persists. Where are the 5 Sodder children? What happened that night? The fire may have consumed their home, but the questions it left behind continue to burn. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. Yet, George and Jenny Sodder could not let go of the burning question that consumed their every waking moment. Where were their children? Their relentless search had led them into a labyrinth of unanswerable questions, false leads, and dead ends. Every piece of new evidence seemed to unravel even more confusion, pushing them closer to the terrifying possibility that the fire that had destroyed their home had been the least of their nightmares. It was late in the fall of 1953 when George received a letter that would mark the beginning of the most haunting chapter in their search for answers. It came on a cold morning, unmarked and written in a hasty hand. Inside, there was no return address, just a short note. The children are not dead. They were taken and are being held. Look for them in the next town over. They are still alive. You will find them. The message sent a ripple of shock through George's body, as if the ground beneath him had cracked open. It was almost too much to process, but at the same time, it was the glimmer of hope they had been waiting for. Someone knew something, someone had the answers. Yet, there was something deeply unsettling about the letter. The phrasing felt cryptic, almost threatening, as if whoever had written it wanted to test the Sodders' resolve. They couldn't shake the feeling that someone was playing a twisted game with them. What did "next town" over mean? Who was sending this letter, and why now? Had someone been watching them? Driven by desperation, George decided to follow the cryptic message. He and Jenny traveled to the town mentioned in the letter, just an hour's drive from their home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. But what they found there only deepened the mystery. The town was quiet, small, and almost forgotten by time. As they walked through its narrow streets, asking around for any information about 5 missing children, they were met with cold stares and silence. The townspeople were polite but evasive. They knew nothing, they said. No one had seen or heard anything. The more they pressed, the more distant the responses became. Felt like a brick wall. Frustrated, but unwilling to stop, George and Jenny decided to visit the local post office and look through public records, hoping for some trace of their children. As they sifted through old documents, they came across something that shook them to their core. A man in the town had been arrested for a crime involving young children. The details were sparse, but there was a report of a strange disappearance. 5 children, ages ranging from 5 to 11, had been abducted from a neighboring town several years earlier. But as quickly as the story surfaced, it was gone, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and forgotten incidents. There was no formal connection between the missing children and the Sodders. But George couldn't shake the image of the man in the report. His face eerily familiar in the way that an old memory can sometimes pull at the edges of your mind. Had he seen this man before? Weeks later, as they continued to chase down their ever-thinning leads, another disturbing event took place. Jenny, one evening, received a call in the middle of the night, a call that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The voice on the other end of the line was garbled, distant, but unmistakably familiar. It sounded like one of their children, but something was wrong. The words were unintelligible at first, then clearer. "We're here, Mom. Help. We're scared." Before Jenny could respond, the line went dead. She held the receiver in her trembling hands, the silence on the other end deafening. Had it been one of their children calling? Or was it a cruel trick? Another message in a long line of ambiguous signs leading nowhere? Jenny was convinced, in the deepest recesses of her heart, that it had been one of them. She had heard their voices, but George was skeptical. He had never believed in coincidences. In his mind, it was more likely another manipulation, another twisted game being played at their expense. As the years wore on, the search for answers seemed to bring more confusion than clarity. The image of the children in the letter, the mysterious phone call, and the growing number of suspicious connections only added to the growing unease that hung over George and Jenny. Then, in 1955, nearly a decade after the fire, a woman came forward with an even more unsettling piece of evidence: a photograph. The woman, a former resident of Fayetteville, claimed she had seen 5 children, looking remarkably like the Sodders, at a local store. They had been with a man she didn't recognize, but she was certain they were the same children she had seen in photographs. She handed George and Jenny the photo she had taken. The picture showed 5 children standing together, almost exactly as they had been the day of the fire, except older, perhaps a little thinner, and with different clothes. The resemblance was undeniable. But the most unsettling part? The children were smiling, their eyes bright, seemingly happy. George and Jenny were torn between hope and horror. Was this evidence of their children being alive, or was it just another cruel hoax? Every new discovery seemed to promise answers, only to twist and distort the truth further. Despite their tireless efforts, the authorities refused to reopen the investigation. The fire had been ruled an accident, and as far as the local police were concerned, the case was closed. Every piece of new evidence seemed to be dismissed as coincidence, every lead as inconclusive. But George and Jenny couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that their children were out there, somewhere, alive, and that they were waiting for someone to find them. Every unanswered question stung with the weight of years spent in uncertainty. Why hadn't the fire consumed their children's bodies? Why had there been no trace of them in the wreckage? Who had been in that car, watching their house in the days leading up to the fire? And what about the strange man seen near their home before the blaze? Could he have had a role in what had happened that Christmas Eve? The facts seemed to spin in endless circles. The more they searched, the more they felt trapped in a never-ending cycle of speculation and dread. Had their children been taken that night? If so, why? And where were they now? As time passed, the questions remained unanswered. The photographs, the strange phone calls, the cryptic letters, all of it led to more uncertainty, more sleepless nights, more memories that refused to fade. George and Jenny lived in a constant state of limbo, where hope and despair battled every day. The fate of the 5 Sodder children remains one of the most perplexing and chilling mysteries in American history. To this day, no one knows for certain what happened on that Christmas Eve. Were the children kidnapped before the fire? Did they escape the blaze and are living somewhere hidden from the world? Or did the fire, despite all evidence to the contrary, claim their lives in a way no one could understand? As the years continue to pass, the mystery endures. The story of the Sodder children and the questions surrounding their disappearance remains unsolved, a haunting reminder of a tragedy that has yet to be explained. The world may have moved on, but for George and Jenny, the search for answers never ceased. The fire took more than their home. It took their peace of mind, and it took their children, leaving them forever lost in the shadows of that fateful Christmas Eve. The years wore on, but for George and Jenny Sodder, their lives were still frozen in that one unbearable moment. The moment when their children vanished without a trace, and the fire that should have been the end of their story became only the beginning. Despite everything, the letters, the photographs, the cryptic phone calls, no one had ever been held accountable. The authorities had long since closed the case, but George and Jenny refused to let go. Their search was not just for their missing children. It was for the truth, and that truth was elusive, slipping away like smoke in the wind. Then came the breakthrough, the moment that would either prove their worst fears or offer the sliver of hope they had clung to for so long. It was a cold winter's day in 1967 when George received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that struck a chord of recognition deep in his gut. The caller claimed to know the whereabouts of the 5 missing children and provided an address. A town just beyond the hills, one that had been mentioned in one of the mysterious letters years ago. The phone call was short, the voice tense, and the connection was cut before George could ask any further questions. With his heart pounding, George raced to the address. His mind raced with the possibilities. Could this be it? Could this finally be the lead that had eluded him for so long? As he arrived at the location, a dilapidated house sat in front of him. Unfamiliar, with windows boarded up and a sense of isolation about it. It felt as if the place had been forgotten by time. George knocked on the door, his breath visible in the winter air, the weight of his determination pushing him forward. A man opened the door. He was older, disheveled, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. There was recognition there, something George couldn't place. The man said nothing at first, only stood there, as if sizing George up. Then, in a voice low and strained, the man said, "You need to leave. This is no place for you." George's heart dropped. He pressed on, determined to get the answers he had spent his life searching for. "I'm looking for my children," George said, voice shaking. "5 children. You know where they are. I know you do. Please, tell me what happened." The man's eyes shifted nervously. Then, with an almost reluctant sigh, he stepped aside and motioned for George to enter. Inside, the house was dark, cold. There was a smell of mildew, of neglect. The man didn't speak, but George could feel the weight of the silence hanging between them like a suffocating fog. He followed the man into a room at the back, where the walls were covered in faded photographs. Pictures of children, 5 children, each one looking startlingly similar to the ones George had lost. Suddenly, it hit him. The photos on the walls weren't just random images, they were his children. They were the faces of his 5 children, older now, perhaps, but unmistakably familiar. A chill crawled up his spine. The man turned to him, his face pale and drawn. "They were taken," the man whispered. "Not by me, but by someone else. Someone who knew exactly how to get them." George's mind raced, the words barely comprehending. Taken. The truth was right in front of him, but it felt like a nightmare, a cruel joke that refused to make sense. Who took them? Where are they? George demanded, grabbing the man's arm. The man recoiled but then looked back at George, his eyes filled with regret and fear. "They're alive. They're somewhere hidden, but it's too late. They've been forced into a life they didn't choose. It's not safe for you to search anymore." George could barely breathe. This was the truth he had waited for, but it was wrapped in more layers of secrecy, more chilling unknowns. What did he mean by forced into a life they didn't choose? But before George could ask more questions, the man's expression shifted. He became agitated, panicked. "You need to go. They'll come for me if they know I spoke." Before George could react, the door slammed open, and 2 men entered, men dressed in dark suits with cold, calculating eyes. The room was suddenly filled with tension, thick enough to suffocate. George's heart raced. The realization hit him like a hammer. These were no ordinary men. They were here to silence him. The 2 men exchanged a glance, and in that moment, George understood. This wasn't just about the fire. This wasn't just about lost children. This was bigger, darker, and more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. He had stumbled into something he wasn't meant to know. Before George could make a move, the men grabbed him, holding him firm. But in the midst of the chaos, George saw the man from the house step forward, his face twisted with guilt and fear. "Leave him be," the man said, his voice wavering. "You don't know what you're doing." The 2 men froze, exchanging looks. The tension was unbearable. "Tell him what happened," the man pleaded. "Tell him the truth." But the men just looked at George with chilling indifference. One of them stepped forward, placing a hand on George's shoulder. "You should never have come here. Your search is over." The other man, cold and calculating, spoke again. "The children are gone. What you're looking for, it's not something you'll find. Leave it." In an instant, they let go of George. As quickly as they had arrived, the 2 men left, vanishing into the shadows. George stood frozen, his mind reeling. He was left standing in a room full of faded photographs of his children. 5 smiling faces, a constant reminder of the life he had lost. George never spoke of what happened in that house again. The clues, the photographs, and the cryptic warnings weighed heavily on his heart. But he knew, deep down, that he had found something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The fate of his children, though still unknown, was something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The fire that had destroyed their home, the strange letters, the phone calls, none of it made sense, and yet, in the darkest corner of his mind, George knew one thing for sure. His children were out there somewhere. And so, the mystery of the Sodder children remains unsolved, lingering in the quiet hills of West Virginia, where a fire burned and 5 children disappeared into the abyss, never to be found, but never truly forgotten. As the years passed, the questions faded into whispers, but George and Jenny Sodder never stopped searching. They never stopped hoping. The answers, however, remain out of reach, lost in the shadows of a tragedy that will never be fully explained. The fire took more than their home. It took their peace, their future, and the only answers they were ever meant to have. Story 7. The Zodiac Killer. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a killer stalked Northern California, terrorizing the region with brutal murders that left the police and public in a state of constant fear. The Zodiac Killer, as he came to be known, didn't just kill. He taunted authorities with cryptic letters and ciphers, daring them to catch him. Each letter sent to the press was a challenge, each cipher a mocking riddle, as he played with law enforcement, refusing to be caught. Despite countless investigations, dead ends, and countless theories, the Zodiac's identity has never been confirmed. The terror he instilled is as vivid today as it was when his letters first appeared, and the question remains, who was the Zodiac killer? And more chillingly, is he still out there? The night of December 20th, 1968, began like any other for Betty Lou Jensen and her boyfriend, David Faraday. The young couple was driving around the rural outskirts of Vallejo, California, a sleepy town nestled in the shadow of the San Francisco Bay Area. The night was quiet, the air crisp with the chill of winter. For Betty Lou, just 16 years old, and David, 17, it was a typical evening. One filled with laughter, innocent conversation, and dreams about the future. They pulled over to a remote spot on a lonely road known as the Blue Rock Springs area, a place where couples often parked to spend some time alone. But this night, as they sat in the darkness, they wouldn't have the chance to say a single word to each other before the terror began. A car pulled up behind them, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. David, thinking it was just another motorist passing by, didn't think much of it at first. But then, the unexpected happened. A man emerged from the car, walked toward David's side of the vehicle, and suddenly pulled out a gun. The killer didn't say a word. He shot David in the head at point-blank range. Betty Lou screamed in terror, but the man wasn't finished. He turned, fired at her, and watched as the young girl fell to the ground in agony. The man, cold and emotionless, didn't rush. He walked back to his car and simply drove off, disappearing into the night. David and Betty Lou never had a chance to escape. Their lives snuffed out in a flash of violence, leaving no explanation, no motive, and no suspects. The police arrived shortly after, finding David dead, and Betty Lou, still alive but fatally wounded. She was rushed to the hospital but succumbed to her injuries. The couple's lives were erased in an instant, their bright futures cut short by a mysterious killer who seemed to leave nothing behind but terror. Just months later, on July 4th, 1969, the killer struck again. But this time, he would leave something more chilling behind. The victims were Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau, who had parked in the same area of Blue Rock Springs, just a few hundred yards from where David and Betty Lou had died. They, too, were ambushed by the same man, who approached their car and opened fire. Darlene was killed instantly, but Michael was fortunate enough to survive, though he was left with wounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The killer didn't flee this time. After shooting both victims, he stood over Michael, demanding that he raise his hands before walking away, seemingly satisfied with the carnage he'd created. Michael, barely able to breathe, managed to stagger to the road and flag down a passing motorist. He told the police what had happened, but again, there were no clues, no suspect, and no clear motive. The killer had vanished, leaving nothing but the sound of gunfire in his wake. It wasn't long before another chilling detail emerged. The killer had taken the time to call the police and report his own crime, taunting them in the process. "I want to report a murder," he told the operator. "If you'll go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you'll find the kids in a car." He offered no explanation, just a cold, detached statement that sent the police scrambling for answers. The Zodiac Killer, as the press would come to call him, wasn't finished with his game. Just days after the attack on Darlene and Michael, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, a letter that would set the tone for everything that followed. It was a masterpiece of cryptic taunts and unsettling threats, written in a bizarre cipher that no one could decipher at first glance. The letter began, "Dear editor, I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl and the boy last July at Blue Rock Springs." The killer, now seemingly bold and confident, included a strange cipher that, when solved, would reveal his identity, though it would take some time for the police and the public to crack it. It was an audacious claim. He was letting everyone know that he was in control, that he was smarter than the authorities, and that he was reveling in the fear he had already caused. The letter was signed The Zodiac, and in it, the killer demanded that his cipher be published on the front page of the newspaper. The Zodiac was now in the game, and he was playing by his own rules. He wanted the world to know his name, but he also wanted to prove that no one could catch him. For weeks, the people of California, along with law enforcement, struggled to decode the cipher. The Zodiac, delighting in his game, sent more letters, each one more cryptic and sinister than the last. He had become not just a killer, but a master manipulator. A man who reveled in the fear he inspired and the confusion he sowed. And the ciphers weren't just a gimmick. They were a chilling declaration of the killer's intent. The Zodiac wasn't just looking for notoriety. He was toying with the police, daring them to keep up, knowing that they were chasing a shadow. He wanted his name out there, but more than anything, he wanted to make it clear that he was untouchable. The public was captivated by the mystery of the ciphers. There was an almost sick fascination with trying to figure out who the Zodiac was, and the pressure on the police grew with every letter that arrived. People began to send in their own theories, and amateur sleuths took it upon themselves to solve the ciphers, but the Zodiac remained elusive, his identity a mystery that seemed to grow deeper with each passing letter. Despite all the attention, the Zodiac didn't stop killing. On September 27, 1969, he struck again, this time in the quiet town of Lake Berryessa, near Napa, California. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia and Shepard, a young couple enjoying a day by the lake, were approached by a man who looked strangely out of place. He wore an odd costume, an executioner's hood with eye holes cut out, a shirt with a symbol on it that resembled the Zodiac symbol, and a large knife in his hand. The man, unprovoked, told the couple that he was the Zodiac and that he had been sent to kill them. He ordered them to the ground and began to tie them up with rope. In one of the most chilling moments of the encounter, the Zodiac drew the same symbol he had used in his letters on Brian's car door with a black marker. The killer stabbed both victims multiple times, but incredibly, Brian survived. He was able to crawl to a nearby road, where he flagged down a passing car and reported the attack. The Zodiac, confident that his work was done, simply walked away, and just like that, he disappeared again, leaving behind another trail of confusion and terror. As if his acts weren't terrifying enough, the Zodiac sent another letter to the press after the Lake Berryessa stabbing. This time, he included a chilling message. "I will not give you my name because you will try to slow me down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife." He taunted law enforcement, claiming that they would never catch him. The Zodiac killer wasn't just a murderer, he was a master of fear. Each murder, each letter, each cryptic cipher added a new layer to his dark legend. He reveled in the chaos he created, the fear he instilled in the community. He was a ghost in the dark, a man who had become as much a part of the myth as the terror he left behind. The Zodiac killer's identity remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in criminal history. Despite the best efforts of investigators and the relentless pursuit by the public, the killer's true name has never been confirmed. He left behind a trail of cryptic ciphers, taunting letters, and unsolved murders, each piece a chilling reminder of the game he played. To this day, the Zodiac killer's identity remains a haunting puzzle, a shadow that still lingers in the dark corners of American history. The terror that the Zodiac killer had unleashed on Northern California had only just begun. After the chilling murders at Blue Rock Springs and Lake Berryessa, the case was rapidly becoming one of the most unsettling and dangerous investigations in history. But it wasn't just the brutal killings that rattled the public and law enforcement. It was the killer's unrelenting taunts and cryptic letters, each one more menacing than the last. With every new letter and every new murder, the Zodiac's confidence seemed to grow. He reveled in the chaos, in the fear he inspired, and most chilling of all, in the fact that no one had a clue who he was. His letters were filled with mockery, as if he were daring the police to catch him, knowing full well they were powerless to stop him. Each one ended with the signature of a cross-circle symbol, his personal mark, a symbol of death, a reminder that he was always watching. As the Zodiac killer's letters flooded the press, police were left scrambling for any lead that could connect the dots. Detectives from multiple agencies, Vallejo, Napa, and even San Francisco, worked together in an attempt to make sense of the growing pile of evidence. But the more they worked, the more elusive the killer became. No one could figure out his pattern. No one knew if he was a local or an outsider. No one could even decide if he was someone close to the victims or a complete stranger. He seemed to appear out of nowhere, striking when and where least expected, and then disappearing like a phantom. Despite the killer's taunting letters and seemingly deliberate attempts to draw attention, the police were at a loss. With every new cipher, every new code, they were pushed deeper into a maze of confusion. The ciphers were often unreadable, baffling even the most seasoned cryptographers. Some of the letters contained vague promises of new killings, pushing the police and the public into a panic. But with every passing day, the search grew colder. In the summer of 1970, after his deadly spree had left 5 victims and countless others in fear, the Zodiac sent a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, a newspaper that had been a constant target of his taunting. This letter contained a new cipher, but this one was different, more complex, more intricate. It was filled with symbols and strange patterns that no one had seen before. In the letter, Zodiac wrote, "I want you to print this cipher on the front page. When you do, you will have me." This was not just a killer's demand for attention. It was a challenge. The Zodiac wasn't hiding anymore. He was daring the police, the press, and the public to solve his puzzle, to break his code. If they could do that, he seemed to suggest they would know who he was. The cipher, later called the 340-character cipher, was filled with a variety of symbols, including numbers, letters, and even runic-like characters. It took over a year to decipher it. The message, when finally revealed, didn't identify the Zodiac's true name but was filled with more disturbing taunts. It was as if the killer wanted to make sure the police and the world knew he was watching them, playing a twisted game, a game that no one could win. While the ciphers captured the public's attention, the Zodiac was still killing. His next known victim was a young couple, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia N. Shepard, who were enjoying a peaceful day at Lake Berryessa in Napa County on September 27, 1969. They had no idea that the man they would soon meet was the Zodiac killer himself. Dressed in a bizarre executioner's hood, the killer approached the couple with a knife in his hand. He announced he was the Zodiac and then proceeded to tie up Brian and Cecilia. For a moment, it seemed like a robbery gone wrong, but what happened next was beyond comprehension. Zodiac calmly and methodically stabbed both of them, as though he were conducting an execution. Brian miraculously survived the brutal attack. While the victims bled, the Zodiac made a deliberate, chilling move. He carved his signature cross-circle symbol into the car door, like an artist signing his masterpiece. The man walked away from the scene, confident that he had once again eluded capture, leaving 2 terrified victims behind. But it wasn't just the brutality of the murder that was terrifying. It was the killer's behavior after the attack. Brian, somehow, managed to survive the stabbing and was able to make it to a road where he flagged down a motorist. When police arrived, Brian described the killer as wearing a hood, but he couldn't give many more details. The man had been so calm, so detached, that Brian barely had time to process what had happened before the Zodiac disappeared into the wilderness. For the police, the attacks were chillingly similar, but there were no answers. They were dealing with a killer who operated in a way they had never seen before. His choice of victims, his ability to disappear after the murders, and his sick game of public humiliation left investigators frustrated and scared. The Zodiac wasn't just a killer. He was an enigma, a shadow slipping through the cracks of society, daring anyone to catch him. As the Zodiac's reign of terror continued, a pattern began to emerge. He wasn't just targeting random victims. He was choosing them deliberately with a sickening precision. The attacks seemed to be calculated, planned out as though the Zodiac wanted to create a legacy, an infamy that would endure long after he was gone. His letters and ciphers were proof of that. He wasn't just a killer. He was a man who wanted to leave behind a mark that the world couldn't erase. Despite everything, the Zodiac continued to toy with the public, toying with the very concept of justice. His cryptic letters grew more disturbing, his demands more erratic, and his taunts more personal. It was as if he wanted to show the world that he was not just capable of killing. He was capable of slipping away, leaving nothing but fear, frustration, and confusion behind. In 1974, nearly 5 years after his first letter, the Zodiac sent one final correspondence to the San Francisco Chronicle. This letter was different from all the others. It was shorter, simpler, and colder. It read, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I have grown tired of the killing. It is time for me to stop." That was the last anyone heard from the Zodiac. The police never found the Zodiac killer, and his identity remains a chilling mystery to this day. For over 50 years, investigators have pored over the evidence, hoping for a breakthrough that could reveal the man behind the mask. But with each year that passes, the likelihood of finding him grows slimmer. Despite the cold case, the terror the Zodiac instilled in the hearts of the people of Northern California still lingers. His name, his ciphers, and his taunting letters continue to haunt those who lived through his reign of terror, as well as those who hear his story for the first time. The Zodiac Killer remains an enigma, a figure from the shadows who may have vanished, but whose chilling legacy continues to inspire fear and fascination in equal measure. The Zodiac Killer's reign of terror didn't just leave the public in fear. It left a chilling trail of bodies, cryptic letters, and unanswered questions. With each murder, the killer seemed to become more brazen, more precise in his choices, and more ruthless in the execution of his crimes. His modus operandi, MO, was as unnerving as his letters, methodical, yet random in its nature. The Zodiac reveled in the chaos he caused, carefully selecting his victims, and making sure every detail, every element of his crime, became part of his twisted puzzle. He was no ordinary killer. He was a craftsman of terror, leaving his signature with every attack. The killer's choice of victims was chilling in its randomness. He didn't seem to follow a pattern based on age, gender, or location. In fact, his attacks were as erratic as they were violent, with one thing linking them together: his ability to strike with deadly precision and disappear without a trace. His first victims, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, were young teens parked by the side of a rural road. He didn't wait for them to make a move, didn't try to rob them. He simply approached their car, pulled out a firearm, and shot David at point-blank range. Betty Lou screamed in terror, and before she could react, the killer shot her too. The murders were swift, but what made them different was the chilling coldness with which he executed them. After the killings, he didn't rush. He had no reason to flee. After David and Betty Lou had been gunned down, the Zodiac simply walked away, disappearing into the night, his actions almost clinical in their detachment. Then came the Blue Rock Springs attack, where the Zodiac killed Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau. The method was eerily similar. The killer approached the couple's car, shot them without warning, and left the scene quickly after. Darlene died instantly, but Michael survived, left alone to bear witness to the horror. What set this attack apart was the Zodiac's bizarre behavior. After the shooting, the killer didn't simply flee. He walked up to Michael, looked him over, and calmly left. It wasn't just a random act of violence, it was an act designed to intimidate. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to make his victims feel helpless, terrified in their final moments. The Zodiac style grew even more sinister on September 27, 1969, when he attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia and Shepard at Lake Berryessa. The Zodiac, now bolder than ever, arrived wearing an executioner's hood and a shirt emblazoned with his now infamous symbol, a crossed circle. In this encounter, he didn't simply shoot his victims like he had done in the past. He tied them up, made them suffer, and even revealed himself as the Zodiac in a calculated, chilling display of power. The Zodiac approached the couple in broad daylight, a stark contrast to his earlier, nighttime killings. The couple assumed he was just another person out for a walk. But when he drew the knife and ordered them to the ground, the horror truly began. He didn't immediately kill them. Instead, he methodically tied them up, took his time as he attacked, and then revealed his true identity. He carved his symbol into Brian's car door before plunging the knife into both of them multiple times. He wanted to make sure his victims knew who he was. The brutality was calculated. The killer didn't rush. He wanted to make his presence known. He was there to remind everyone, particularly the survivors, that he was in control and they were powerless. The Zodiac even took the time to ensure that one victim, Brian, lived long enough to describe the attack to the police. It wasn't enough to kill them. He wanted to torment them, leave his mark, and force the world to acknowledge his twisted supremacy. The Zodiac's killing spree would have been terrifying enough without the cryptic letters and ciphers. But it was these that elevated the terror to a level unlike anything law enforcement had ever faced. His ciphers were not just puzzles, they were a declaration. Every letter was a challenge to the authorities, to the public, and to anyone who dared to try to catch him. He wanted to make sure that no one could forget his name. With every murder, every letter, every cipher, the Zodiac made it clear he was the one in control. One of the most chilling aspects of his MO was his need to communicate with the public. His letters were filled with taunts, but they were more than just idle threats. They were calculated messages to send the world into a panic. His letters contained specific threats, demands for recognition, and, of course, more ciphers. They were often filled with bizarre and ominous wording, like the letter he sent in July 1970, which read, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to paradise all the sooner." This letter contained one of his most famous ciphers, the 340-character cipher. The Zodiac loved the idea of being a puzzle that couldn't be solved. He wanted to be remembered as more than just a killer. He wanted to be a symbol of fear, an unsolvable enigma. His letters mocked law enforcement, daring them to crack the codes, knowing full well that they would fail. The Zodiac Killer was different from other serial killers in one significant way. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to terrorize. His choice of victims, his method of killing, and his cryptic letters all served one purpose: to spread fear. He didn't just want to end lives. He wanted to make the world tremble with the knowledge that he could strike at any time, anywhere, and disappear into the shadows. What made his killings even more terrifying was the randomness of it all. There was no clear link between his victims, no pattern that law enforcement could follow. He struck wherever he pleased, in different towns, different settings, and at different times. One day it was a young couple in a car, the next a man and a woman by a lake. There was no comfort in knowing when or where the next attack might come. It could be anywhere, and it could be anyone. The Zodiac's ability to remain elusive only deepened the fear surrounding him. He seemed untouchable, his method of evasion flawless. Even after his last known murder, the killings didn't stop. His letters and ciphers kept coming. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to own the investigation, to control the narrative. The police were left scrambling, playing catch-up, and unable to break his twisted puzzle. By the mid-1970s, the Zodiac Killer had all but disappeared, but his impact was far from over. His last confirmed murder took place in 1969, but his cryptic letters and the unanswered questions about his identity kept the public on edge. The ciphers were never fully solved, and the Zodiac's identity remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in criminal history. The last letter the Zodiac sent was in 1974, in which he claimed he had grown tired of killing but would still kill again if he felt like it. After that, he vanished into thin air, as if he had never existed at all. The finality of the letter left no sense of closure for the victims' families, for law enforcement, or for the terrified public. The fear that the Zodiac instilled never really disappeared. It continued to lurk in the corners of society, a reminder of how truly terrifying the unknown can be. And to this day, the question remains, who was the Zodiac Killer? Despite countless investigations, theories, and even new technologies, the true identity of the Zodiac Killer has never been confirmed. The case remains open, but the fear he sparked lives on. His killing spree, his letters, and his cryptic puzzles are a haunting reminder of how far a killer can go to taunt a world that is desperate for answers. The Zodiac Killer had left his mark on Northern California like a scar that would never fade. With his chilling letters, cryptic ciphers, and brutal murders, he'd instilled fear in an entire region and beyond. Yet, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the Zodiac vanished. By the mid-1970s, there were no more murders, no more taunts, and no more letters. Law enforcement was left with a hollow case, and the people of California were left to wonder. Had the Zodiac stopped killing, or had he simply moved on to another place, another time? The unanswered questions lingered, festering like an open wound. But the most unsettling truth was that the Zodiac had never been caught. In a case that had seemed so close to being solved, the killer slipped through their fingers like smoke, leaving only the eerie feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for his next moment to strike. Years passed, but the Zodiac case never grew cold. Every new generation of detectives, amateurs, and armchair criminologists would revisit the mystery, poring over old clues, hoping for a breakthrough. The case continued to haunt Vallejo, Napa, and San Francisco, the cities where the Zodiac had terrorized with his randomness and his precision. The fear didn't just disappear, and neither did the speculation. The fact that the Zodiac's identity remained a mystery was a source of maddening frustration for law enforcement. Every lead led to dead ends. Every suspect brought forward seemed more like a potential red herring than a true connection. The ciphers, though partially cracked, still held secrets, and the lingering question of who the Zodiac was refused to be answered. His letters, with their dark promises and coded messages, kept the investigation alive in the public's mind. But the killer remained just as elusive as the shadows he hid in. Then, in the early 2000s, advancements in DNA technology offered a glimmer of hope. Perhaps modern forensics could unlock the puzzle. With fresh eyes on the case, some believed a breakthrough was imminent. And yet, every time the case seemed to edge closer to resolution, it slipped away again, just as the Zodiac had. As the years went by, a series of men were proposed as suspects, each one adding another layer of mystery and confusion to the case. Some were close to the victims, others had questionable alibis, and some had histories of violence. But every time investigators thought they had the Zodiac in their sights, new evidence or inconsistencies emerged, unraveling the case even further. One of the most popular suspects was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester with a history of bizarre behavior. He was known to have made odd statements, and his appearance in police sketches seemed to match descriptions of the Zodiac. But despite being investigated thoroughly, there was no concrete evidence linking him to the murders. Allen's death in 1992 brought an end to any further investigation into his involvement, and the Zodiac killer's true identity remained elusive. Other suspects, including the likes of Richard Gaikowski and Gary Francis Post, have been proposed over the years, but again, each theory has failed to offer anything conclusive. There were too many gaps in the evidence, too many unknowns. The more investigators dug, the more the mystery seemed to expand, becoming a tangled web of speculation, theories, and frustrating dead ends. Even as recently as 2021, new efforts have been made to identify the Zodiac through DNA testing on letters he sent to the press. However, each breakthrough has been met with skepticism, as no definitive match has been found. It's as if the Zodiac had woven himself into the fabric of the case so seamlessly that nothing could fully unravel it. The fear that the Zodiac created lingers in the collective memory of those who lived through his reign of terror. For many, the true horror of the Zodiac wasn't just the killings themselves, but the idea that anyone could be a target. He was a killer without rules, a man who seemed to pick his victims at random, and yet each crime was carried out with a chilling sense of purpose. His cryptic messages, his bizarre need to control the narrative, and his willingness to let the police and the public chase him while he remained just out of reach. This was the essence of the Zodiac. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to terrorize, to manipulate, to play a sick game of cat and mouse that no one could win. The Zodiac's letters, some of which were published in full by newspapers, became legendary in their own right. They were more than just taunts. They were a window into the mind of a killer who seemed to relish in his ability to control the people around him. Each letter was more than just an attempt to claim credit for the murders. It was a message, a riddle, a puzzle for the police to solve, but also for the public to decipher. The Zodiac wanted the world to know who he was, but he wanted to remain just out of reach, like a ghost. As the years turn into decades, the question of who the Zodiac killer was still remains unanswered. The chilling reality is that no one has ever been able to provide a definitive answer to that question. The case remains open, but it has grown cold, unsolved, haunting, and as terrifying as ever. While many killers have been caught, their motives understood, and their crimes solved, the Zodiac's case remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. What drove him? Why did he stop? Was his last letter a promise of more killings, or had he truly grown bored with the game? As law enforcement shifts focus to other cold cases, the Zodiac Killer is never far from their minds. Despite new tools, new technologies, and a deep, collective desire to uncover the truth, his identity remains one of the most terrifying unsolved puzzles in the world of true crime. His legacy is one of fear, uncertainty, and frustration. A reminder that sometimes, the most terrifying killers are the ones who leave no trace, no pattern, and no answer. In the end, the Zodiac Killer's true identity remains a ghostly question mark. The terror he unleashed, the lives he destroyed, and the unanswered questions he left behind continue to haunt anyone who attempts to piece together the puzzle. Whether or not the world will ever know who the Zodiac was remains to be seen. But with each passing year, the answers seem further out of reach, his identity growing more distant and his legend more chilling. The Zodiac Killer is not just a figure in criminal history. He is a symbol of the fear that remains even in the absence of answers. A terrifying reminder that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are the ones we can never solve. More than 50 years have passed since the Zodiac Killer terrorized Northern California, leaving behind a legacy of fear, confusion, and unrelenting mystery. Despite advances in forensic science, numerous investigations, and countless theories, the true identity of the Zodiac Killer remains one of the greatest unsolved criminal puzzles in history. His cryptic letters and ciphers continue to haunt those who tried to crack them, and his murders, random, brutal, and calculated, still echo in the nightmares of those who lived through them. The fear he instilled in the public was matched only by the frustration felt by law enforcement, who were always a step behind, never able to catch him. In 1969, the Zodiac seemed to vanish, leaving behind only questions. Did he stop killing? Was he caught and the truth hidden? Or did he simply fade into the shadows, continuing his life undisturbed while the world continued to search? As years passed, his legend only grew. From police sketches to suspects who never fit, the puzzle of his identity became a story passed down through generations. Every new theory felt like a glimpse of hope, only to end in disappointment. The Zodiac Killer's final letter, written in 1974, was the last time the world heard from him. His last known murder remains over 50 years old, and still, his name is one of the most haunting in criminal history. While the Zodiac may have slipped through the cracks of time, his terror is not easily forgotten. His story, like the ciphers he left behind, remains a cryptic reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. The Zodiac Killer is more than just a name. He is a symbol of the fear and uncertainty that can never be erased. And so, the mystery endures, unanswered, unresolved, leaving behind only the chilling question: who was the Zodiac Killer? Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. If you enjoyed the journey, be sure to like, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. We appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe and stay curious.